Chapter 311. A strong dryness appeared in the mountain valley. There was no temperature higher than the air, but as Ku Shichuan's red eyes faded, the moisture in the air in front of Ding Ning suddenly disappeared. From the moment he started to challenge Duanmu Jingzong, Ding Ning's expression had been calm to the point of almost indifference. He had an unreasonable dominance. But when he sensed this strange dryness, Ding Ning's brow immediately furrowed. He retreated as fast as he could. His shoes made tearing sounds. His body shot back like lightning, but he could not keep up with the speed at which Ku Shichuan's thick red smoke condensed from his left hand. There was no sound, but a terrifying aura had already arrived in front of him. Ding Ning's lips were pressed into a line. The last flower remnant sword in his hand suddenly gave off light. He did not seem to make any intense movements, but multiple blue sword threads lit up in front of his chest. With a boom, the blue sword threads immediately exploded and disappeared. Where the sword threads disappeared, a ball of deep red flame exploded. The blue sword threads jumped and flashed in front of Ding Ning's body, faster than the shooting stars in the night sky. Then they disappeared, and the same deep red flame appeared. Ding Ning's body continued to fly backwards, his body vibrating strangely. The balls of deep red flame in front of him bloomed like giant peach blossoms. Most people in the mountain valley stopped breathing. Even the proudest Jing Liuli's expression turned cold. True shock flashed through her eyes. "What sword is this?" she asked Yintai Guanjin next to her. Even she had never seen it before and did not understand Ku Shichuan's sword. It was a sword and not a sword form. In her perception, the thick red smoke rising from Ku Shichuan's left hand was the gathering of fine dust. These fine dust were completely different from the primal energies of the universe that cultivators absorbed. They were extremely heavy and unusually dry. They immediately absorbed all the moisture in the surrounding air. Then the fine red dust condensed into a deep red shadow, faint and indistinct. But it was still a real sword. The fine dust condensed into a sword in Ku Shichuan's hand and flew towards Ding Ning like a flying sword. This was like the life-bond sword and flying sword of a powerful cultivator. But the way the dust condensed and the strange presence was very different from the life-bond sword of a cultivator. With Ku Shichuan's cultivation that had just reached Realm 4, he could not touch the life-bond domain. Yintai Guanjian also frowned deeply. He looked with a grave expression at the deep red peach blossoms blooming in front of Ding Ning and said gravely, "This is the red mercury sword." Jing Liuli expressionlessly repeated, "Red mercury sword?" Making red mercury from heavy mercury, refining it into a sword in the body. It is a method between life-bond and non-life-bond, shapeless and tangible. A cultivation method that the pill masters of the Yu dynasty accidentally comprehended. Yintai Guanjian did not turn to look at her and explained, "The pill masters of the Yu dynasty all gathered in the imperial palace, so this cultivation method was not taught to outsiders. It was lost after the Yu dynasty died. Back then, it was an unorthodox cultivation method that was harmful to the body of a cultivator. So there are only a few records." Jing Liuli immediately sneered. "So it is a method of imitating life-bond before reaching life-bond. Heavy mercury is very harmful to the body of a cultivator. After being refined into powder, it is even more dry and violent. It is absorbed into the vital energy in the body. No wonder this Ku Shichuan's personality is growing more irritable." Hearing her scornful and disdainful words, Yintai Guanjian shook his head and said, "Too fast." He was the fastest cultivator in Min Mountain Sword Sect, and even in the world. He naturally had a clearer judgment of sword speed than anyone else present. This kind of red mercury sword was not a life-bond sword or a flying sword, but at least it had an attack method similar to a life-bond flying sword. Even though this red mercury sword was just a straight shooting attack, for any cultivator below Realm 5, this kind of speed was too fast. In the world of cultivators, it was publicly acknowledged that a Realm 4 cultivator alone could not defeat the flying sword of a Realm 5 cultivator, even if that person's flying sword was clumsy. Where the will was, the sword would fly. This kind of speed was much faster than a cultivator's hand. Unless multiple cultivators below Realm 4 worked together, they could not win. If one went too much in one place, they would win everywhere. Dugu Bai's brow furrowed tightly, and his tone carried a hint of coldness. At this time, Ku Shichuan had completely put down the blood-red sword in his right hand and allowed the sword to fall to the ground next to him. No wonder he is ranked in the top 3 of the Book of Talents. Now that I think about it, while the Earth Vein Sword is extraordinary, he is not qualified to be ranked like that on the Book of Talents with just the Earth Vein Sword. Other than Yintai Guanjian, the other cultivators in the valley did not know what sword Ku Shichuan was using right now. But everyone could see that Ding Ning was in a dangerous situation. In order to deal with the deep red sword shadows that were constantly changing, Ding Ning had used the Aurora sword that pursued speed. At this time, Ku Shichuan's posture appeared extremely casual. The situation between Ding Ning and Duanmu Jingzong seemed to have completely reversed. Ding Ning seemed to have become Duanmu Jingzong, and Ku Shichuan seemed to have become Ding Ning. At this time, Ku Shichuan really said what Ding Ning had said to Duanmu Jingzong previously. Ku Shichuan looked disdainfully at Ding Ning and said, "Can you be faster?" As this voice sounded, the air around him started to vibrate violently, and the vital energy he gave off grew stronger. With a whoosh, the faint, deep red sword light grew several times wider, and the straight sword path suddenly started to twist. In everyone's eyes, it was as though a red carp had suddenly appeared in the darkness between him and Ding Ning. After one red carp, there were many more. Red flames continued to appear in front of Ding Ning like blooming peach blossoms. In everyone's eyes, it was as though many red carps were jumping out of the water and pecking at the blooming peach blossoms. But in reality, these peach blossoms were formed when the red carps arrived. Because they were so fast that even the cultivator's eyes could not help but see an illusion. Jing Liuli narrowed her eyes. Her eyes were dyed red by the deep red sword light. She could see that Ku Shichuan's red mercury sword was not flying very fast, but because of the natural vibrations caused by the infusion of power, the red mercury sword's flight became erratic. The sword path was erratic, harder for the enemy to judge, and faster. A thread of blood flowed down from the corner of Ding Ning's mouth. As his body rapidly retreated, this thread of blood was blown up by the wind and moved forward slightly. In the next moment, the beads of blood formed by this thread of blood did not fall down or scatter. They flew forward, attracted by the dry, heavy mercury dust, and were instantly sucked dry. Ding Ning's hand holding the sword was still steady. He did not seem to have changed at all, but many people still caught such a minute scene, especially those who were most concerned about his safety. Zhang Yi also saw such a minute scene. He knew that Ding Ning looked fine, but under the continuous attacks of the other, his internal injuries had worsened. His face had been pale since Ding Ning started to challenge the remaining opponents. At this time, his lips were trembling. But Du Gabai, Li Shixing, and the others who were also seeing this scene had not expected Zhang Yi to say, "Junior sect brother Ding Ning will win." While his voice was trembling, it was filled with an indescribable determination and confidence. This kind of voice caused Du Gabai, Li Shixing, and the others to feel that he had a basis for his judgment and was not just comforting themselves. Du Gabai turned his head, but he did not have the time to ask why. Because at this time, Ku Shichuan's disdainful voice sounded again. "Can you be any faster? Even if you can be faster, how long can your vital energy last?" Ku Shichuan's eyes were filled with pleasure. The pleasure at this time made him feel that it was not enough to just say a disdainful sentence. Some heart-palpitating dark red energy started to flow between the fingers of his right hand. The red carp jumping in the air started to shrink and become smaller. More condensed and smaller meant that the resistance would be lower, and he would be faster. Even more importantly, the deep red energy flowing out of his right hand was not injected into the mercury sword, but pressed against the sword and attached to the two sides of the blade. It was like the small red carp had grown wings. The valley became absolutely silent. Only Ku Shichuan's disdainful voice echoed. Many people had an ending in their minds. When the next attack landed in front of Ding Ning's body would have a sword wound and blood. But at this time, Ding Ning looked up. In the darkness, Ding Ning shook his head. Chapter 312. I do not have to be fast just because you are fast. A fast sword doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use a faster sword to deal with it. Ding Ning spoke. When he opened his mouth to speak, a new sword essence had already formed in front of him. It was no longer the sword essence of the Aurora sword. This new sword essence formed at a unique time. The moment Ku Shichuan's Pill Mercury sword turned from a red carp to a red flying fish, and then sped up, the dry air in front of Ku Shichuan and him suddenly rippled with moisture. As he spoke, the water vapor created by his sword essence rippled forward, and there seemed to be many transparent waves in the air. Then he put his sword away. Almost everyone couldn't believe their eyes. Ding Ning clearly did not want to attack a second time. Since he had put his sword away, with Ku Shichuan's sword speed, he could not attack a second time. So he felt that this attack was enough to deal with Ku Shichuan? But how was this possible? In their perception, Ding Ning's sword essence was extremely faint. When Ding Ning used this sword essence, he did not use large amounts of vital energy. These layers of transparent waves did not contain much power. How could such a sword move stop Ku Shichuan's attack? Even if a miracle occurred, how could he not use a second attack? In this moment, only Yintai Guanjian, Jing Lioli, and a few others thought of something, and their eyes lit up. It was too fast. Ding Ning had just spoken, and Ku Shichuan had only heard one word, so he did not detect anything wrong. There was a crack. His sword broke through the air. In this moment, the Pill Mercury sword, like a red flying fish, shattered countless water curtains without feeling any resistance. The transparent water curtains were shattered into powder. The fine water droplets were attracted by the dry Pill Mercury and flew towards the deep red sword. These extremely fine water droplets quickly seeped into the dried mercury cinnabar. Right now, this small sword with astonishing speed smashed into the layers of water curtains, creating a powerful squeezing pressure in this small and narrow space. The powdery water vapor seeped in even faster than Ku Shichuan's vital energy. The small flying sword was like a whale sucking in water. The layers of waves were shattered into powder, and all the water vapor was sucked into the sword. The extremely dry Pill Mercury became wet, and then a fine flow of water appeared in the dry land. The water flowed through the sword like a net. The thin sword became fat like a steamed bun that had been soaked in water for too long. The change in the sword was a true qualitative change. This sword was no longer stable, starting to sway and vibrate. In an extremely short amount of time that no cultivator could catch, it vibrated countless times. Other than Yintai Guanjian and a few others, the other cultivators watching could not detect the change in this sword. But the master of this sword, Ku Shichuan, finally sensed something was wrong. But it was too late to change anything. This sword was in front of Ding Ning. At this time, Ding Ning had not finished speaking. His last flower remnant sword had just been sheathed at his waist. This deep red Pill Mercury sword was facing Ding Ning's throat. When Ku Shichuan sensed something was wrong, this Pill Mercury sword was less than 3 feet from Ding Ning's throat. When he felt inexplicable terror, the tip of the Pill Mercury sword was just a few inches from Ding Ning's throat. The sharp wind created by the sword energy created a red on Ding Ning's throat. Then the red dot started to seep out of real blood. This red was about to quickly expand and become an open wound. But in this moment, this Pill Mercury sword gave off a powerful vibration and then disintegrated. The steel-like Pill Mercury sword turned into rouge that was washed away by the water and exploded. The sword energy spread, creating the most beautiful explosion of the Min Mountain sword trials so far. The rouge-like mercury powder was carried into the air by the fine air currents, forming numerous deep red branches and leaves. Then at the ends of these branches, the scattered mercury powder bloomed like peach blossoms. A peach tree that was prettier than any peach tree in the world bloomed with countless flowers. These flowers fell on Ding Ning's body. Ding Ning's body seemed to be covered in rouge and turned into a pink person. But Ding Ning was still standing. His sword was back at his waist. He closed his mouth as he spoke and paused for a moment, so much so that his one sentence became 2 sentences. When this deep red peach tree completely collapsed, and the heavy and damp mercury powder fell to the ground in strange straight lines, Ding Ning's second sentence reached everyone's ears. He was still speaking, but Ku Shichuan's sword had disappeared. He seemed to be used to just now's speed, but could not get used to the coming slowness. A long time after Ding Ning's voice disappeared, Someone in the valley moved and made a sound. Then there was a wave of gasps and gasps. This is just clouds and mist rise. This is the first move of Cloud Water Palace's wind and rain mist. Jing Liuli was among the people who inhaled deeply. Jing Liuli took a deep breath and said slowly, "This is not even a complete sword move." Yintai Guanjian was still shrouded in shock. This clouds and mist rise was just a sword move that gathered some water essence for the wind and rain mist rise. It was used to connect and change between sword moves. Yet Ding Ning used such a move to defeat Ku Shichuan's red mercury sword. When Ding Ning faced this attack, he had thought of many possibilities, but he had not thought of this one. At this time, Jing Liuli spoke softly again. This time, her expression was grave and unspeakably serious. "I am not as good as him." Lin Suixin's smile had disappeared. He frowned and looked at Ding Ning, who had been dyed pink. He hesitated and then shook his head. Too great. Then he felt the surging emotions in his heart could not be soothed. He said to himself, "A true monster." More and more people woke up from their incomprehension and shock. What kind of comprehension and swordsmanship is this? The so-called Dugu family is skilled in sword moves that return to nature. Compared to him, they are a joke? Dugu Bai looked at Ding Ning in admiration and then turned to look at Zhang Yi, who was still dazed on the ground. "How do you know he will win?" "Because my junior sect brother is smarter than us. Even we thought that Ku Shichuan may not be able to enter the top 3 with the Earth Vein sword. He must have guessed that Ku Shichuan is hiding even stronger sword moves." Zhang Yi's gaze was still on Ding Ning. He struggled to answer Dugu Bai. Since he must have thought of it beforehand, with my junior sect brother's personality, if he did not have absolute confidence, he would not use such a method to continuously challenge them. Because this does not just concern his victory, it concerns the glory he promised Shui. Zhang Yi's words were purely an explanation, but Dugu Bai and the others heard a meaning greater than life and death. He is a man of his word. Li Shixing bowed his head slightly and said. Ku Shichuan was motionless. His face was pale to the extreme. Sweat flowed down his forehead and soaked his clothes. He and Ding Ning were not greatly injured. Not far from him was the blood-red thin sword that he had used before. Why is he not attacking again? Why is Ding Ning not attacking just now? Seeing this scene, a student could not help but speak. In his view, while Ding Ning's attack just now was indescribably profound, strictly speaking, the battle was not over. Even though Ding Ning's abilities and cultivation were far above Ku Shichuan's, if Ku Shichuan was shameless and did not admit defeat, he could still fight. Based on the previous events, Ding Ning could not be as soft-hearted as Zhang Yi. You think it is because he does not want to attack again? It is because he does not dare to take that sword. He does not dare to attack. A teacher from the cultivation ground answered his question with a cold voice. This student stilled. His gaze landed on Ku Shichuan and Ding Ning. Then he and the other students understood the meaning in the teacher's words. At this time, Ku Shichuan's sword was stuck in the ground several feet away. Ding Ning had put away his sword, but his hand was still by the hilt. Ku Shichuan's pill mercury sword had dissipated. Ding Ning could still be fast. When he had pulled out that sword, Ding Ning's sword essence should have reached his body. Ku Shichuan did not have the confidence to try. So it was not that he did not want to fight, but he did not dare to attack when Ding Ning looked at him like this. Xiaorou's lips trembled again. She could not describe her feelings at this time. She looked at Ku Shichuan and thought of the many humiliating words this person had said to Ding Ning. She thought of Xie Changsheng. She knew that if Xie Changsheng was here, he would say something. She usually hated Xie Changsheng for causing trouble, but at this time, she could not help but speak and say what Xie Changsheng would definitely say. Her clear voice reached everyone's ears. You do not dare to fight and are not willing to admit defeat. If I were you, I would find a piece of tofu and kill myself. Chapter 313. Ku Shichuan's body had been extremely stiff. Hearing Xiaorou's words, his body started to tremble. He did not want to admit defeat. There was another way to admit defeat, to leave silently. But at this time, his sword was on the ground next to him. If he turned and left, he would lose this sword. For the swordsman of Chongling, this was a great humiliation. He did not want to speak, but did not dare to pull out the sword next to him. This was a true dilemma. Because of this dilemma, he remained where he was. Most of the people present had not recovered from their shock. They had enough patience to see how things would develop. But not everyone was patient, especially when the result was already decided. Lin Suixin turned slightly. He looked at Ku Shichuan, who remained motionless despite Xiaorou's trembling voice. He sneered. You still do not admit defeat. Do you really want him to stab you? Or should I have someone find a piece of tofu? Ku Shichuan could not ignore Lin Suixin's words. Thinking of how today's events would appear in the records of the future, and the expressions of many people when they talked about this in the future, his trembling lips opened slightly. Before he could make a sound, he sprayed out a mouthful of blood. Blood sprayed. Peach blossoms bloomed in front of Ku Shichuan again. Ku Shichuan looked dazedly at the dots of blood on the ground. He smiled bitterly, his smile containing indescribable pain. He could feel the reverse blood in his body still surging. Any normal cultivator would try to control the reverse blood in their body because the reverse flow of blood in the meridians would bring about many worse results. But at this moment, Ku Shichuan felt that everything was meaningless. Even after putting in so much effort, he could not defeat Ding Ning and could not even receive the other's blow. What was the meaning of life like this? Ku Shichuan turned around in pain. As he laughed hoarsely, a mouthful of blood came out of his lips again. Then he fell to the ground in an ugly posture. Then, he nonchalantly got up, walked a few steps, and fell down again. Looking at his struggling figure in the night, many students felt that he was just an empty shell. Without defeat, how can there be victory? Wanting to defeat all your opponents with a sword move that no one has seen before is the biggest mistake in itself. Jing Lieli looked at Ku Shichuan's figure in the darkness and shook his head without any sympathy. A person like this, even if he enters Min Mountain Sword Sect to study, what accomplishments can he have? Junior brother. Zhang Yi rushed to Ding Ning's side and began to clean up the mercury powder on Ding Ning's body in a flurry. Everyone could feel his excitement and joy, as well as his admiration and care for his junior brother. Therefore, no one felt that his actions were inappropriate or that he was being overly sentimental. No need. Ding Ning only used his sleeve to wipe around his eyes and then shook his head at Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi paused. Looking at Ding Ning's clean features, he shook his head and said stubbornly for the first time, "If you win one more round, you will be first. How glorious will that be? How can I let junior brother welcome such glory in such filthy clothes?" No need. Ding Ning shook his head again. He looked at the students standing in the distance and said slowly, "Look at them. Even if I appear sloppy now, will they look at me differently?" Zhang Yi stilled. He followed Ding Ning's gaze and swept across the students in the distance. Looking at those trembling and unconsciously avoiding Ding Ning's gaze, he started to understand the difference between now and the beginning of the trials and what true glory was. Zhang Yi thought of Shui Wangxiu and was speechless. There was only one step left. Everyone's gaze landed on Yi Haoran. In reality, even if Ding Ning lost to Yi Haoran in the end, Ding Ning was already the legend of the trials. Even many years later, many people would remember this wine shop youth and the glory of him in White Goat Cave. But after seeing this legend, everyone felt that only by defeating Yi Haoran and announcing the appearance of a third monster in the Qin dynasty other than in Baoshi and Jing Lieli would not be perfect. Many people in the valley were not willing to see Ding Ning win, but they subconsciously wanted to see such a legend appear. So their emotions were conflicted and indescribable. Ding Ning and Zhang Yi also looked at Yi Haoran. Of all the students facing Ding Ning, Yi Haoran was the only one who did not avoid Ding Ning's gaze. Under everyone's gaze, this youth from Li Lingjuan's establishment had a calm expression. "I had not expected you to reach this step." He looked at Ding Ning and said calmly, "In reality, when I saw you win against Ku Shichuan, I hesitated if I should yield to you in this last battle. This way, I would become a legend. It's just that I've thought it through. There's no point in giving it up or not. Since you have enough confidence, even if I do not yield, I may not be able to win against you. If I do not yield, I may be able to see an even stronger performance." Ding Ning nodded and did not respond. But Du Guobai was the first to be shocked and excited. Ding Ning walked towards him, towards the pile of wooden swords he had sharpened and had not used. "Are you sure it is possible?" Dugu Bai looked at the approaching Ding Ning, and his voice trembled. With a ripping sound, Ding Ning tore off a strip of cloth from his clothes. When he tied all the wooden swords to his back, he bowed and thanked Dugu Bai. At the same time, he said, "It should be fine. Please teach me in the future." Dugu Bai had thought of Zhang Yi and Ding Ning as good friends. But when he saw Ding Ning bow, his expression turned solemn and he bowed deeply. This was the etiquette of meeting a teacher. In Dugu Bai's view, Ding Ning was qualified to be his teacher. The Dugu family was famed in the world for their comprehension and use of sword essence. Even Dugu Bai, the most talented member of the Dugu family in history, was so respectful to Ding Ning. This was enough to move most people present. Other than Zhang Yi and the others who knew what these wooden swords represented from the start, no one else knew what these wooden swords were used for. But these wooden swords clearly belonged to Dugu Bai. Seeing Ding Ning turn around with these wooden swords and walk back to the arena, all the students and cultivation teachers felt powerless. If this really meant a powerful sword move, then it meant that Ding Ning had absolute confidence in defeating Ku Shichuan just now. He had even more powerful moves. Everyone could not help but think that if Ku Shichuan saw this scene, he would be even more embarrassed and unable to bear it. This bundle of wooden swords was slightly heavy on his body. Ding Ning frowned slightly and did not want to waste more time. He pointed at Yi Haoran and raised his sword to his chest. Yi Haoran smiled slightly. "I must lose. I must let you win, but I must also have you die." As he smiled, a murderous voice sounded inside. But he did not draw his sword as everyone expected. He nodded at Ding Ning and then closed his eyes. An uproar. His posture of resting with his eyes closed suddenly made his figure appear much more indifferent, calm, and unhurried. This kind of presence surpassed all the previous students. In the next moment, a brand new and powerful aura was released from his body. There seemed to be a new door opening in the world around him. Many threads of new primal energies of the universe rushed towards his body in joy. Realm 5. Before most of the students could react, Jean Liuli looked down and said coldly, "Breakthrough on the spot?" She did not intentionally lower her voice at this time, and it was like a cold wind that swept through the valley, causing those who did not understand what was going on to react and let out even more chaotic cries of surprise. It was very difficult for cultivators to have breakthroughs. The higher they went, the more difficult it was. With every realm up, many people would be stuck at the juncture, unable to comprehend the breakthrough for their entire lives. Yet, Yi Haoran had easily had a breakthrough in the quiet and joyful atmosphere. This meant that he could enter Realm 5 a long time ago. He could enter Realm 5 at any time. Between Realm 4 and Realm 3, there was a great difference in the ability to use primal energies of the universe. There was a huge difference between Level 5 and Level 3. Realm 5 meant that one could use true flying swords. Yi Haoran had entered Realm 5 with his eyes closed. Who could guarantee that he had not grasped how to use flying swords? Ding Ning stilled, his brow furrowed. Then, something unexpected happened. Ding Ning also closed his eyes. More wind currents appeared in the forest. In this moment, many fresh presences started to surge towards his body. Everyone held their breaths at this moment. Even Lin Suixin's eyes widened. Breakthrough. They were all having breakthroughs. Ding Ning was having a breakthrough with his eyes closed. Chapter 3:14. The same breakthrough, and Ding Ning was just Realm 3 to Realm 4, but it shocked everyone even more. Ding Ning had only started cultivating at White Goat Cave last autumn. Even though all of Chongling later learned that Shui Wangshu had given the spirit vein of White Goat Cave to Ding Ning for cultivation, his cultivation speed from Realm 3 to Realm 4 could not be described as fast, but inconceivable. Especially after Ding Ning had reached profound understanding in half a day, his cultivation advancement had always been the focus of attention. Most cultivation places knew that at the start of the trials, he had just barely reached the peak of Realm 3. So Yi Haoran could be confident that he had reached his cultivation level a long time ago. But in order to hide his cultivation, he had been standing in front of that door and had only crossed it at this time. But Ding Ning was different. Ding Ning could not have reached this door early on. He had just reached this door and crossed it. This kind of breakthrough without any obstacles was not recorded in the history books. If one did not see it with their own eyes, they would not believe it. The entire mountain valley was filled with shock and disbelief. But at this time, Jing Liuli smiled. Previously, her smile was very cold, and it was always filled with a kind of sharp fighting spirit. However, at this moment, her smile was very warm and bright. Yintai Guanjian could not help but turn to look at her. He worried that Jing Liuli's mind would have problems and affect her future cultivation. Who dares to believe it? Although his cultivation is not the highest at his age, he has surpassed most of his peers in this world with just 1 year of cultivation. Who would suspect that he is just a flash in the pan? Jing Liuli did not look at Yintai Guanjian. She still smiled brightly and said, "Starting now, Min Mountain Sword Sect has 2, and Lingshu Sword Gate only has 1. Min Mountain Sword Sect is the top sword sect of the Qin dynasty." Yintai Guanjian stilled. He immediately realized that his worries were wrong. Jing Liuli spoke of 2 Min Mountain Sword Sect. One naturally referred to herself, and the other was the present Ding Ning. And Lingshu Sword Gate only had 1. Naturally, it referred to Embark. So Jing Liuli was able to say such words because she was standing at a different height. She was looking very far, and she was looking at the future. Yi Haoran's eyelashes trembled slightly. Then his eyes opened, bright as stars. His plain white robes spread in the air around him. A powerful ripple of primal energies of the universe appeared above the mountain valley, mixed with intimidating sword essence. His presence was calm and stable. His vital energy and primal energies of the universe flowed through his body without any awkwardness. Just as everyone in the valley had guessed, he could have entered Realm 5 long ago, as long as he took that step. Sensing the fresh presence coming from the other side, he did not show much shock in his eyes. He could not help but smile slightly and say to himself, "Interesting." This kind of breakthrough, which was not even recorded in the history books, was naturally an unimaginable thing for him. But in his eyes, Ding Ning was about to die. So Ding Ning's breakthrough only amused him and did not cause any shock. A soft hum came from his sleeve. A small white hiltless sword flew out of his sleeve as though it was alive. Many students and cultivation teachers in the mountain valley narrowed their eyes. They all knew that just like the red mercury sword was Ku Shichuan's true sword, this flying sword that had been hiding in Yi Haoran's sleeve was Yi Haoran's true sword. After a soft hum, there was a swoosh. The handleless small white sword turned into a firefly and instantly appeared behind Ding Ning, stabbing at the aorta on his neck at an angle. Ding Ning opened his eyes at this time. He did not even have time to raise his hand. Yet as his vital energy poured in, the cracks at the front of the last flower remnant sword filled with flowing light. The sword threads danced and formed numerous threads of indigo sword energy in front of the white sword. The white sword light collided with these threads of sword light and lightly flew back. The broken threads of indigo sword energy immediately disappeared. But multiple bloody marks appeared on Ding Ning's neck and started to seep blood. Yi Haoran looked calmly at Ding Ning, his hands hanging at his sides. He did not make any special movements, but the flying white hiltless sword dimmed and disappeared into the night. When the flying sword disappeared, even the spectating students felt great terror. Cultivators below Realm 5 did not have much resistance against the unpredictable flying swords. This kind of terror was as natural as animals seeing their natural enemy. At this moment, Yi Haoran's flying sword was so unpredictable that they clearly realized that Yi Haoran had used some unknown method to practice the flying sword technique. If they were to fight against him, they probably wouldn't even have time to react before they were killed. Where did the white flying sword go? A soft sound came from the grass in front of Ding Ning. Bits of grass flew up, but he still waited silently and did not immediately attack. A weak sword shadow silently bypassed the messy bunches of grass close to the ground. Then it suddenly jumped high into the air, turned into a bolt of lightning, and stabbed viciously at the back of Ding Ning's head. At this moment, Ding Ning did not even look behind him. His waist and abdomen exerted strength, his entire body twisting as he swung the last flower remnant sword towards this sinister, flying sword with a momentum that could lift the sky. As though it had eyes at the back of its head, the last flower remnant sword accurately met the hiltless white sword. There was an explosion. The small white sword still flew backwards, but the white sword light on the sword produced wave-like ripples. Without any pause, Ding Ning ignored Yi Haoran, who was not far behind him. His slightly arched body leapt up like a leopard, and the sword in his hand that had not been completely pulled back slashed down again. There was another explosion in the air. The white flying sword retreated again. Ding Ning advanced again, the last flower remnant sword in his hand, creating a flash of shadow that accurately hit the hiltless sword. A violent sound came again. It was just a short remnant sword, but in Ding Ning's hand, it gave everyone the feeling that he was holding an enormous hammer. Ding Ning chased after the sword. Many students in the valley grew paler. If they encountered a flying sword like this, they would only despair and be killed by it. But at this moment, Ding Ning was chasing after this flying sword and attacking it. Such a violent posture caused Ding Ning to no longer be on the defensive. Seeing this scene, Yi Haoran only smiled faintly, slight disdain in his eyes. The 5 fingers of his right hand moved slightly, as if he was pulling on some invisible strings. At the same time, the vital essence in his body suddenly flowed faster. The white flying sword that had been retreating in the air suddenly gave off an explosion. With a boom, it was as if 2 sledgehammers had collided with each other in the air. A blast of air, visible to the naked eye in the darkness, exploded between Ding Ning and the small sword. Ding Ning's body suddenly stilled. The thin, hiltless white sword only flew back a few feet, and then made a strong arc. It broke through the spreading wave of energy and stabbed at Ding Ning's brow like lightning. Ding Ning retreated. His feet kicked up dust on the ground. The last flower remnant sword in his hand lightly deflected the force and sent the small white sword flying downwards. The small white sword didn't seem to have made any contact with his body, but a tear suddenly appeared on his clothes, a fresh wound appearing. With a hum, the small white sword flew back, sticking close to the ground and creating a wave of dust. Almost all the cultivation teachers started to breathe heavily. Ding Ning's performance against the flying sword could be called perfect, especially his calmness. When facing a flying sword, being able to maintain calmness at all times was the most important thing. The calmness he showed was comparable to the attendance of some swordsmen. If Ding Ning's vital energy cultivation was close to Yi Haoran's, even if Ding Ning did not know how to control a flying sword, in everyone's eyes, he had a high chance of defeating Yi Haoran. But there was an intrinsic difference in power. This was the greatest problem right now. Muffled explosions continued to ring out. The thin white hiltless sword and the last flower remnant sword continuously met in the air. Ding Ning's body trembled violently. He accurately grasped the trajectory of the flying sword each time, but each time the flying sword came close, it still left some wounds on his body. The redness on Zhang Yi's face had long since faded and turned pale. He looked at the increasing number of wounds on Ding Ning's body and sensed Yi Haoran's malicious intentions. Yi Haoran wanted to kill Ding Ning. Yet with people like Yintai Guanjian and Lin Suixin present, he could not kill Ding Ning with one blow. But he could continuously add new wounds to Ding Ning's body. As blood continued to flow, Ding Ning's blood would run out and he would die, unless Ding Ning admitted defeat. But Zhang Yi knew that Ding Ning would not admit defeat. So Yi Haoran's method was to slowly kill Ding Ning like a death by 1,000 cuts. Chapter 3:15. Yi Haoran's right hand, hanging outside his sleeve, constantly moved, occasionally plucking a murderous string. He looked calmly at Ding Ning, whose robes were gradually soaked in blood. He found that Ding Ning's resolve was stronger than he had expected. He felt more admiration, but his slender fingers suddenly shook. With this movement, the small white sword on Ding Ning's back grew brighter, and a layer of strange white mist appeared around him. As this small white sword danced around Ding Ning, the white mist around Ding Ning grew thicker. Almost all of the cultivation teachers frowned deeply as they watched the white mist form. This was the most orthodox Wu mountain cloud and rain art, the legacy of the Chu imperial palace. The white mist formed by this flying sword art could cause Ding Ning's attacks to become sluggish and use up more power. Previously, they all had their own thoughts. Many did not want Ding Ning to win, but now, All of them wanted Ding Ning to win. Because Ding Ning was of the Qin. Jing Liuli's frown deepened. She did not feel that Ding Ning was certain to lose. Ding Ning had his own reasons for carrying those wooden swords. Up until now, Ding Ning had not used those wooden swords. This meant that he had not used all his power. But she could not understand what Ding Ning was waiting for. While the wounds were small, if countless wounds bled together, the blood in the body would quickly run out. A mocking smile appeared at the corners of Yi Haoran's mouth. He also did not understand what Ding Ning was waiting for. But in his view, no matter what Ding Ning was waiting for, it was a futile effort to increase his pain before he died. He looked up at the black sky. The small white sword flying in the white mist hummed even more harshly. When it passed by Ding Ning's body, it did not just bring up drops of blood, but also pieces of flesh. Gungren narrowed his eyes. He had experienced many cruel escapes that cultivators could not imagine. Adding on some unique research of cultivators' bodies, he knew better than any of the cultivators present what kind of reaction a cultivator's body would have when their blood flowed to a certain degree. He knew that while Ding Ning appeared to be conscious, if he was an ordinary cultivator, his consciousness would have been blurred. This had something to do with strong willpower. Sometimes, when one's willpower was strong to the point of forgetting one's own body, it could cause one's body to produce extraordinary power. However, Gungren knew very well what the consequences of going against common sense would be. When one's body exceeded its limits for too long, it would suddenly and completely lose control. At that time, his consciousness would not be slowly blurred, but would suddenly be cut off. It should be about time. Lin Suixin had seen many cultivators with even worse wounds. So even though Ding Ning had countless tiny wounds on his body, he did not have much expression on his face. But after Gungren narrowed his eyes, he frowned and said softly. At this time, Ding Ning started to feel truly dizzy. His consciousness seemed to want to leave his body and fly up into the sky. But he was still very calm because he had experience that even Gungren could not imagine. He knew he had a dozen breaths of time left. His left hand started to reach back and gripped the rough hilt of a wooden sword. Uncontrollable cries of surprise rang out. At this time, nothing had happened. What everyone saw was Ding Ning's hand landing on the hilt of a wooden sword behind him. But everyone knew that something astounding would happen in the next moment. This premonition made many people feel shocked in advance. Ding Ning swung his sword steadily. With a whoosh, the wooden sword slashed out. A seal line at the center of the sword gave off a unique green sword light. Even more strangely, Ding Ning's sword slash was released, and he followed the momentum of the slash and slashed the wooden sword out. After the first slash, there were many slashes. All the cries of surprise disappeared, because everyone had sunk into an even stronger shock that was close to numbness. Ding Ning usually used his right hand to wield a sword, but at this time, his left hand seemed to be faster than his right hand. His left hand seemed to have disappeared into thin air, yet it still maintained a certain perfect frequency as it continued to slash. All the wooden swords on his back were slashed out by him in an instant. Even more importantly, the last flower remnant sword in his right hand accurately blocked the flying sword that was attacking him again. Everyone was under the illusion that something was wrong. The person who had completed such a slash was not a youth who had not learned the sword for many years, but a great swordsman who had cultivated the sword for hundreds of years. He seemed to have practiced this sword move his entire life, and turned it into a direct reaction of the body. Dugu Bai's breathing stopped completely. Because he had such a sword move and path in his mind, he saw this slash before anyone else. He saw many green lights fly out of Ding Ning's back and form a green screen. This was an indescribably beautiful green light screen. However, the moment it expanded outwards, this light screen instantly disappeared. All the wooden swords split apart from the seal scripts on the swords and were torn apart by the great power into dancing with threads. However, the green light in the rune did not disappear. Instead, it connected together and turned into a real sword light. This sword light seemed to be parallel to the entire ground. It was absolutely straight, as if it wanted to completely separate the space above from the ground. It silently sliced towards Yi Haoran's body. Dugu Bai knew that this was true peacock green. Yi Haoran frowned deeply. He found that he did not even have time to call back his flying swords to block such a profound and powerful attack. His eyes immediately became crystal clear. His body roared as though many beautiful new worlds were forming in his body. A new passageway appeared in many of his meridians. The primal energies of the universe that had been absorbed in his body surged out of his body through this passageway. Fortunately, he still had a sword. The sword at his waist hummed. It was about 6 feet long and less than 2.5 fingers wide. The spine of the sword was a rare sky blue, and the 2 blades were transparent. The sword jumped out of the sheath and landed in his hand. Fine air currents spat out from the sword. Countless sparkling and translucent crystal dust spurted out from the transparent blade, forming a sparkling and translucent crystal disc in front of him. There was a loud bang. A cloud of dust rose around his body. The sparkling and translucent crystal disc was directly cut into pieces by the absolutely straight green sword light. The shattered crystal dust scattered in all directions and bounced back on his body, making popping noises. Yi Haoran's body splashed with blood. The powerful impact caused his body to leave the ground and fly backwards. Ding Ning saw this scene, but he did not feel any joy. He knew that this attack was not enough to defeat Yi Haoran, and he did not have much time left. He took a deep breath. A mysterious and cold aura appeared around his body. An empty and cold presence appeared in his body and then quickly disappeared. True coldness spread from his body. Visible white flakes of cold mist formed around his body and sputtered outwards. It was as if ice had just formed on the surface of a lake, but the lake water had not completely solidified and was still rippling. Wisps of red yuan qi appeared clearly in these ice shards like lines of blood. Blood fiend Moart. How can he? Although they were shocked to the point of numbness at that moment, there were still many people who were unable to control their emotions and shouted loudly. Yintai Guanjian's eyes widened, and his pupils unconsciously contracted. He felt he was seeing something he could not understand. So this is how it is? Jing Liuli thought to herself. Since she thought Ding Ning was stronger than her, she felt anything was possible. Yi Haoran's expression froze slightly. The disdain on his face completely disappeared. In this moment, he took a deep breath and then raised his hand. He did not call back his flying sword. The small white hiltless sword had fallen close to the ground. At this time, new power was injected into it, and it howled as it fell towards Ding Ning's back. Chapter 316. A meteor flashed across the dark sky. Yi Haoran's flying sword also fell towards Ding Ning's back like a meteor. Seeing this scene, many of the spectating Min Mountain Sword sect cultivators couldn't help but feel cold. There was a time difference at any moment in a battle. Many times, the timing was determined by the small time difference. When Ding Ning used the true peacock green, Yi Haoran's defense had not been able to completely block it. Now that he used this flying sword to attack, the time difference meant that he could not deal with Ding Ning's next attack. Even if Ding Ning used the simplest sword form, if he could reach him, he would not be able to stop it. Therefore, his current actions meant that he had chosen to perish together with them. From the start of the trials, Ding Ning had shown that winning was more important than life and death. So in the view of these cultivators, victory was more important to Ding Ning than life and death. If Yi Haoran attacked someone else like this, other people might dodge out of fear of death, but Ding Ning would not retreat. The result was that both of them would die. While all the cultivators hoped that Ding Ning could win, they had to admit that this youth from the Chu dynasty was a madman and a monster. There was too little time. Before anyone could think about what choice Ding Ning would make, Ding Ning had made his choice. Countless fine white flowers bloomed on the last flower remnant sword. These fine flowers and sword essence were moving forward, but in this moment, the last flower remnant sword was forced to bend backwards. There was an explosion. Everyone felt as though their hearts had been hit. Ding Ning gave a muffled grunt. For the first time, his body lost its balance and he stumbled forward several steps. Zhang Yi opened his mouth but could not make a sound. His vital energy instinctively surged towards his feet, and he was about to leap forward. The hearts of Du Gubai and the others sank to the bottom. Jing Liuli's breathing paused slightly, and his expression grew ugly. Yi Haoran laughed. It's over. That was what he said in his heart. Then, In his mind, he released the boundary that had been restricting the flow of his true essence. The remaining true qi in his body flowed freely and without reservation through his meridians. In that instant, it gushed out from the 5 fingers of his left hand. A vast presence that all the students present felt they could not resist exploded with him as the center. Other than Yi Haoran, all the students in the mountain valley were realm 3 or 4 in vital energy cultivation. What Yi Haoran displayed now was true realm 5 power. Countless mottled colors appeared on Yi Haoran's face. He did not hold back and used all of his power. The poison immediately flared up. However, the smile at the corner of his mouth grew even wider. Everyone could sense that an invisible river had appeared in the air. This long river flowed into the small white hiltless sword that had just been sent flying backwards by Ding Ning's attack. The small white sword gave off a wild presence. Due to the rapid acceleration and vibrations, the entire sword immediately became translucent. Yi Haoran did not fight the pain. Seeing the small white sword fly back to Ding Ning's back, he followed his body's will and fell backwards. "I admit defeat." At the same time, he spoke. This was also a time difference. According to the rules of the trials, if one admitted defeat, they would lose. However, at this moment, his sword was definitely faster than his voice. Such a fast sword. After piercing and shattering Ding Ning's heart, Ding Ning would not immediately die. With Ding Ning's strong resolve, he could probably stand for a few more breaths. The final result of this grand event that attracted the attention of the world was that he admitted defeat, and Ding Ning won first place, but Ding Ning would die next. Zhang Yi's body had left the ground and was flying at a speed exceeding his usual limits. But no matter how fast his body was, he could not be faster than that flying sword and could not block in front of that flying sword. Everyone was certain that Ding Ning could not stop this sword. This had nothing to do with talent, but a difference in pure power. But at this time, Ding Ning's body gave off an unusual scent. His skin started to become mottled. The last flower remnant sword in his hand lit up with threads of light. Then the entire last flower sword turned into countless tiny threads that started to weave in the air. Yantai Guanjian's tense expression relaxed, and then his eyes were filled with shock and admiration. At this time, only he had the time to sense a wondrous and beautiful scene. The tiny sword threads dancing in the air had even finer white flowers. These sword threads crisscrossed like cloth and were tightly entangled together. Who would have thought that the broken last flower sword could be used like this? The white flying sword crashed into the sword threads. The sword threads could not match the power of the white flying sword, but these tightly woven sword threads were like a net, or even a cocoon. They firmly held onto this flying sword and bought Ding Ning a sliver of time. Ding Ning's fingertips that gripped the sword sprayed out a fine mist of blood. He could no longer hold the last flower remnant sword. But using the pull of this sword, his body was forcefully tilted in this tiny moment. Poof! The white flying sword carried the last flower remnant sword and charged into his left shoulder socket. Then it came out behind his body with a spray of blood. The bones in his left shoulder were almost completely shattered, but this sword was unable to pierce and crush his heart. The shattered sword energy and the spray of blood gave off soft hissing sounds. At this time, Yi Haoran finally said the first of the 3 words, "I admit defeat." Everything seemed to have frozen, but Yi Haoran's admission of defeat still reached everyone's ears and appeared strange. Zhang Yi had charged to Ding Ning's side. He reached over and supported Ding Ning's body. He felt that Ding Ning's body seemed to be weightless, but he did not know what he should do. Wonderful. Just as Zhang Yi's mind was blank, loud cheers sounded, followed by applause. The one clapping was Lin Suixin. Then many Min mountain sword sect cultivators in the darkness started to clap. Even the distant mountain paths gave off clear applause. Zhang Yi felt a wild wind blow past, and then his hand became even lighter. Yantai Guanjian's figure had disappeared, and so had Ding Ning in his hand. Why admit defeat? Why admit defeat and kill Ding Ning? He wants Ding Ning to win the Min Mountain Sword Trials, and wants to use this chance to kill Ding Ning. Everything was settled. Jing Liuli thought seriously with a bowed head and murmured to herself. Li Lingjun does not want the Empress to win. He does not want the Empress to be happy, but he hates Ding Ning. He wants Ding Ning to die. The legendary benevolent and modest gentleman is a vengeful and narrow-minded person. He is not useful and will be a mediocre ruler in the future. In a flash, she understood why Yi Haoran had done this and made a judgment about the future of the new king of Chu. So, he risked his body being dismembered to slowly exhaust Yi Haoran's true essence. Then, he used the peacock green and used the blood fiend devil art to force out Yi Haoran's final sword. All of this was under his control. Then she started to recall every detail of the battle just now and was shocked again. She found that while this result was Yi Haoran's choice, Yi Haoran did not have a choice in the end. As Ding Ning continued to bleed, Yi Haoran's vital energy was also consumed. In the end, when Ding Ning used the blood fiend demon art, Yi Haoran did not have much vital energy left. Therefore, for Yi Haoran, it was already the right time. Is this what Master said I lack? The ability to stay out of the situation and see the big picture? Jing Liuli slowly exhaled and was silent for a long time. She had thought of many things, but the entire valley was just starting to wake up. Waves of cries of disbelief rang out unceasingly. Xiero looked at the place where Ding Ning had blocked Yi Haoran's last blow. Her body and lips trembled so she could not speak. He is first. Li Shixing said these words simply. At this time, he was the calmest of the group. He will not die. Then this youth, who seemed to be afraid of the cold, straightened his collar and said seriously, I am sure. Li Shixing's voice was steady and loud. He is first. He will not die. This kind of voice suppressed many cries of surprise and echoed in the valley. Zhang Yi started to recover. He sensed all the mountains were echoing. He sensed the gazes of all the students and cultivation teachers. He looked at the blood that Ding Ning had spilled on the ground and sensed that the blood was shining. Even though it was night, he sensed light coming down from the sky. He looked up and seemed to see Shui Wangshu smiling at him and the entire valley with a satisfied and mischievous smile. He knew this was glory, the glory that his little sect brother brought. Chapter 317. Ding Ning won? This youth from White Goat Cave really won the Min Mountain Sword Trials? While everyone knew this was the truth, many people still did not dare to believe that this youth from White Goat Cave had won against Palace Attendant Rong's arrangements and the will of the Empress who had never been defeated. Looking at these dazed students and cultivators, Lin Suixin put down the scroll in his hand, cleared his throat, and announced with a rare faint smile, the Min Mountain Sword Trials have ended. Ding Ning is first. Lin Suixin was the organizer of the last sword trials and represented all of Min Mountain Sword Sect. When his voice sounded, everyone was startled awake and accepted this truth. Many students looked at each other. They were usually the best of the best and were very proud. But at this time, they did not see any dissatisfaction in each other's eyes. No one dared to be dissatisfied. No one would be dissatisfied, because Ding Ning had shown so much power in the trials that they may never be able to catch up in their lifetime. They then looked towards Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi's side was empty. Ding Ning was not there right now, but everyone knew he was alive, and the glory that followed belonged to him. Missing at the moment when he should be the center of attention was like Ding Ning's usual calmness. They felt uncomfortable. It was as though he disdained to enjoy their shock, jealousy, and admiration. Could Ding Ning's calmness towards them be understood as disdain, disdain to explain, and disdain to be with them? The valley grew silent. Each Min Mountain Sword Trials was different, but the trials were usually very lively at the end. Many people congratulated, many people wept, and many people cheered victory. But never had it been so silent. The glory was so great that people felt ashamed of their own inferiority. A green palace in the mountains pierced the sky like a sword. On the peak, Bailey Sushue, dressed in white robes, looked silently at the scene in the valley. He suddenly found it amusing. A person like him could not suppress his emotions. So he laughed out loud. Clear and melodious laughter drifted into the valley along with the mountain wind and the sound of cicadas. All the teachers in the valley heard this laughter. While they could not see Bailey Sushue's figure, they knew from the dominance in the laughter that this was the master of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Hearing Bailey Sushue's laughter, these people felt even more emotional. This was especially true for people with special identities and statuses. On the mountain path, the middle-aged man in yellow robes who had replied for palace attendant Rong stood motionless for a long time like he had turned into a statue. On the other hand, Sikong Lin, the vice bureau chief of the Bureau of Rights, was so excited that his entire body trembled uncontrollably. Huang Jinwei turned to look in the direction of Bailey Sushue's laughter, a hint of admiration in his eyes. Pan Rui shook her head and said with a cold expression, "I don't think she will stop here. His Majesty is still in this mountain." Then she said in an even colder voice, "Even if it is against the Empress arrangements, Bailey Sushue's actions are too presumptuous. In reality, she is a very qualified mistress." Huang Jinwei rarely argued with Pan Rui, but at this time, he shook his head and expressed a different opinion. No one in Chongling is more suited to be a mistress because she knows how to balance and control better than anyone else. Our Qin dynasty has Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate. After a pause, Huang Jinwei looked at Pan Rui and said, "The Qin dynasty can lose Min Mountain Sword Sect, but we cannot lose these two major cultivation places together. Even more importantly, if we lose Min Mountain Sword Sect, we will quickly lose Lingshu Sword Gate." Pan Rui thought for a moment and said, "Because there will be no sense of security?" Huang Jinwei was shocked that Pan Rui could understand so quickly. He nodded and said softly, "A sense of security is a wondrous feeling. Some people would rather have a powerful opponent than see that powerful opponent disappear. Because powerful opponents can often help each other. If you are alone, the uncertainty and lack of security is enough for a person to do something completely different." Pan Rui looked expressionlessly at all the cultivators in the mountain valley and said slowly, "The cultivators of Chongling do not have much sense of security, but she knows where the boundary is. So she will make the cultivators of Chongling feel insecure, but not too insecure." Huang Jinwei felt that her conclusion was accurate. He was also surprised that Pan Rui would say these things. So he looked at Pan Rui and did not know what to say. Pan Rui did not say anything. Since she had stayed here to see the final result, and the result was already decided, she had no need to stay. So she nodded at Huang Jinwei and turned to leave. Her beautiful figure quickly disappeared into the shadows of the mountain path. The resting camp was even more deathly silent than the mountain valley. Many of the officials moving through the camp intentionally avoided Palace Attendant Rong's tent with fearful eyes. They felt that Palace Attendant Rong would be furious right now. No one was willing to be tainted by her anger at this moment. Yet, no one had expected Palace Attendant Rong to show no anger in the tent. She was deep in thought with her head bowed. Where did Lying Hong go? When all the students accepted the fact that Ding Ning had won the Min Mountain Sword Trials, someone finally recalled the name that had always been first on the Book of Talents. Yi Haoran and Ku Shichuan. Even though they had lost to Ding Ning in the end, they still showed strength far surpassing ordinary students. Lying Hong was first on the Book of Talents. How could he have fallen into the Sea of Brambles? Also, everyone knew that Lying Hong from Jiaodong Commandery should have been Palace Attendant Rong's most important pawn. While most of the cultivation teachers had seen with their own eyes how Lying Hong had left, these cultivation teachers had not had many chances to interact with these students after entering the mountain valley to watch the trials. So none of the students knew what Lying Hong had encountered. Lying Hong was defeated by Xie Changsheng and Shan Yi. Multiple cultivation teachers spoke at the same time and answered that student's question. The mountain valley was silent for a moment and then exploded with a boom. Of the people who had followed Ding Ning, only Xie Changsheng and Shan Yi had not entered the final trials. Yet, who would have thought that they had defeated one of Ding Ning's most important enemies? In the end, this seemed to be White Goat Cave's victory from start to finish. Many students thought bitterly that Ding Ning and these people had won from start to finish. Ding Ning wins, first place. Ding Ning is alive. A court official walked out of the sword gate of Min Mountain Sword Sect and rode a carriage to a patch of wilderness. There was a large carriage parked in the wilderness. Inside the carriage, a black-robed man with a calm presence and a dangerous feeling held a pot of hot tea. Opposite him sat a plain-robed man. Hearing the news this court official brought, The black-robed man and the plain-robed man laughed. The two exchanged a look. The plain-robed man could not help but say, "The impossible has been done. This Chongling has countless possibilities." Night still shrouded Chongling. The distant fires had been extinguished long ago, but an even more dangerous presence flowed through the air. Bai Shanshui moved through the streets of Chongling. She walked carefully, each rise and fall of her body ensuring that she would not be seen by any of the turrets in Chongling. She was not far from the outskirts of Chongling and a branch of the Wei River, yet a sword-like cold light flashed through her eyes. The moment she stopped walking, a figure walked out of the alley to the left in front of her. He stopped under the black roof and looked at her silently. "Since you have returned to Chongling, you should have told me." A low but unusually steady and deep voice rang out. "Liang Lian, General Yang." Bai Shanshui's eyes narrowed slightly, her heart trembling. She sneered and said, "I guessed it was you. You can come and go as you please, and do not need to inform me. But I cannot be at ease in this city." Liang Lian, who was standing straight under the roof, looked at Bai Shanshui and said coldly and decisively, "In reality, I do not want much. I do not want you to die. I only want you to hand over the lonely mountain sword hoard." Bai Shanshui laughed and said, "This is not much." Liang Lian shook his head. "Is some unreachable old dreams more important than life and death? Even that person in the Bazin Kendo ground will disappear. What is impossible in Chongling?" Bai Shanshui put away her smile, puffed out her chest and said slowly, "Also, you do not want the lonely mountain sword hoard, but her. You need her pity to survive. So how can you pity me? Why do I need pity?" Bai Shanshui looked up. A glowing drop of water appeared in the sky. Chapter 318. Rain inexplicably fell on Chongling's Sun Alley. This rain only covered this part of the street. In an area of nearly 1,000 feet, the neighboring streets had become incomparably dry. Even the drought-resistant wormwood on the roof tiles had suddenly lost its moisture, turning from dark green to withered yellow. Yet, none of the residents in this alley detected anything unusual. They did not even hear the sound of rain. Before the rain fell, some white smoke had spread with the wind. This white smoke carried a sweet scent and caused the people who had been sleeping to sleep even more deeply. The clean rain washed the dust from the roof tiles and the cracks on the ground, but could not wash away the darkness in Bai Shanshui's brow. Only a few dozen breaths had passed since the first drop of water fell to the torrential rain, but she already felt tired. After the battle on the Wei River, her cultivation had not recovered. At this time, there were more than 30 flying swords flying through the air around her, hiding in the wind and rain, hiding above the roof tiles, hiding in the muddy water formed by rainwater. They even disguised themselves as withered grass that was blown by the wind, floating in the gutter with the waves and slowly approaching her body. None of these flying swords were a match for her. Most of the masters of the flying swords were far from her cultivation right now, and were not a match for her. But there were too many flying swords. It took too much effort to maintain vigilance against all these flying swords. Even more importantly, she knew that the masters of these flying swords were just pawns for the Qin dynasty army to use up her strength. In the surrounding night sky, she needed to focus on sensing the swords that had yet to appear. 2 twisted flying swords fell on the ground next to her, like dragonflies that had been stepped on after having their wings torn off. They looked terrible. Just by paying the price of 2 flying swords, they were able to delay her in this alley for a few dozen breaths. This could only mean that the organizer of this ambush was too good. Looking at the flying swords that were not in a hurry to get close and were just patrolling, Bai Shanshui knew she could not hold back at all. Her bright red lips pursed into a thin line. Her tongue curled slightly, and a golden glass-like pill that she had been suppressing under her tongue quietly slipped out and bumped into her teeth. The pill shattered in her mouth, and the golden liquid flowed down her throat into her stomach. Her thin brows were slightly furrowed. She didn't know if it was heartache or real pain. Then, she stretched out her left hand and used her index and middle fingers as a sword to stab above the eaves on the left. A low, suppressed shout rang out. A gray silhouette seemed to emerge from the black tiles, and flew backwards with a curtain of blood. At the same time, a crystalline water droplet that was completely different from the surrounding rain appeared in the sky above by Shanshui. The reason why it was so different was because there was no dust in this drop of water. It repelled all the dust in the air and even repelled the moisture in the surroundings. This drop of water seemed to have come from the heavens and did not belong to this mortal world. However, as it rapidly fell, countless fine ripples began to vibrate within the sparkling droplet, as if it was made by nature. Bai Shanshui's brows began to loosen. The water droplet fell faster and faster, brighter and brighter. The entire sky above her began to tremble. Her body seemed to have completely recovered, and an astonishing amount of heaven and earth essence chi began to gather from all directions. The clouds moved in all directions. Even the water on the ground, which had been flowing along the ground, began to tremble and flow toward her. In the darkness, many cultivators looked in shock at the growing power contained in the water droplet. They all felt a mountain falling from the sky. A thick green sword light came out of Bai Shanshui's hand. The power contained in the water droplet grew unimaginable. There was a hiss. A circular wave of energy exploded in the sky. All the falling rain droplets exploded into mist. The water droplet passed through the mist, and the roof tiles in this alley were crushed. The long sword in Bai Shanshui's hand, which was like a jade pool, welcomed this drop of sparkling liquid. The droplets that fell with a mountainous aura did not seep into the blade of her sword. Instead, as she narrowed her eyes, a cold light flashed in her eyes, and the droplets were shattered by the sword in her hand. Even smaller droplets of water splashed out. It was like a real mountain had been shattered by a sword in this space. Every tiny droplet of water was like a huge rock that had been thrown out. There were countless rocks flying in this space. Clang, 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 clang. Dense and heavy sounds of collision sounded. All the flying swords that had been flying through the curtain of rain around Bai Shanshui all fell to the ground. In the darkness, balls of bloody mist sprayed out. It was just a drop of water, but it had brought about such a shocking and desolate scene. Bai Shanshui did not show any pride. She knew this was just the beginning. An extremely domineering shout burst out from her mouth. At the same time, her body passed through the falling flying swords and through more than a dozen courtyards. A thick yellow sword light appeared in front of her, violently slashing towards her flying body. Bang! A muffled sound. The hairband she used to tie her hair suddenly snapped, and her black hair fell to her shoulders like a waterfall. She and her sword were forced back dozens of feet by this wild sword light. She was forced back by a sword. As time passed, she still did not manage to charge out of this alley. She had a bitter taste in her mouth. She knew that most of the Chongling experts who were a threat to her were in Min Mountain, or not far from Min Mountain Sword Sect. Also, Liang Lian wanted to atone for his crimes by merit. He would not give this merit to others. So even if there were cultivators of her level here, there would be very few. Even if it was this cultivator who had forced her back, she had enough confidence to deal with him. But she lacked a personal attendant. She could not divide her attention to deal with the flying swords that could come at any time when she was dealing with a cultivator of this level, and there was more than one. Also, there was Liang Lian who had yet to act. If her senior sect brother was still here, maybe he could tear apart a corner of the encirclement. But her senior sect brother had died long ago. As though hearing the call of her heart, a sharp sword hum suddenly sounded between the white walls and black tiles. Pew 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 pew. More than a dozen sounds of flesh being torn apart sounded. A meteor-like sword light carrying the scent of blood flew to her side. After killing more than a dozen cultivators surrounding her, it flew to her side like it was protecting her. The sword essence was facing in front of her. In anyone's first impression, this was a sword that would fight alongside her. Bai Shanshui thought so. However, in the next instant, she suddenly noticed that something was wrong, and her expression turned cold. The sword in her hand that was like a jade pool slashed towards the flying sword. The meteor-like sword light gave off a wild hum and sped up. When it was hit by Shanshui's sword, the entire blade bent and gave off a wild and bloodthirsty presence, spinning past Bai Shanshui's side. The side of Bai Shanshui's robe tore open soundlessly and was instantly filled with blood. Bai Shanshui's eyes burned with anger. All was deceit in war. This was a clever tactic in battle, but she did not like to be deceived. In this moment, she did not even focus on sensing the large sword in front of her that could attack at any time, and the most sinister flying sword that was imitating dried grass as it floated towards her. She focused on sensing Liang Lian's presence that had been hidden since the start of the battle. Even if it was meaningless, she would enjoy the last moment. Liang Lian wanted to keep her. Since she was fated to not be able to leave, then she would kill Liang Lian first. However, at this moment, several broken tiles fell from the eaves. The several broken tiles fell into the ditch where the flying sword disguised as withered grass was, creating several splashes of water. A splash flew out of the muddy water under the flying sword. It was very strange, but no one noticed. The water splashed high. When it reached a height that surpassed common sense and did not fall, the cultivator who had forced Bai Shanshui to retreat suddenly felt something was wrong. But his attention was not on that side, because there was his companion, a powerful cultivator's flying sword disguised as dried grass. Therefore, just as he was about to react and defend himself with his sword, the splash of water had already leaped into the air and landed on his neck. With a light touch, the head of the cultivator who had forced Bai Shanshui to retreat separated from his body and flew out. "Protect me," a familiar voice sounded. When the voice sounded, Bai Shanshui took a deep breath. Her flying figure smashed towards the courtyard where the person was like a wave. Pew 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 pew. There was a violent sound in the air. Many flying swords and weapons with cold light fell towards this cultivator who was not part of the plan. Bai Shanshui attacked. The wave-like sword light swept away all the cold light falling towards the cultivator. She landed next to the person in the courtyard. Her body trembled continuously, but her hand holding the sword was exceptionally steady. Previously, she needed a personal attendant, but now, she was like this person's personal attendant. Chapter 319. Your flying sword is very strong. Bai Shanshui said to the person in the courtyard, "But you may die. I was a dead person long ago." The cultivator in the courtyard looked at Bai Shanshui and shook his head. He said softly, "Do not misunderstand. I just want to ensure that you do not fall into their hands alive. If such a time comes, I will kill you first. Please do the same to me, and do not let me fall into their hands alive." Bai Shanshui smiled in satisfaction when he heard these impolite words. He lifted his head and said, "Very good." A wild wind rose, and the night was in chaos. More than a dozen white lines appeared in the sky and fell towards the courtyard. These white lines were either sword formations created by cultivators of the sword schools or powerful weapons. Even from far away, one could feel the terrifying power contained within. But the cultivator next to Bai Shanshui did not pay attention to these white lines. Even as he spoke to Bai Shanshui, his mind was firmly focused on his thin flying sword. His flying sword was very short. When it flew out of the turbid water, it was mottled with the same color as the turbid water. Yet, when the sword cut off the head of the expert under Liang Lian, his sword turned into a restrained deep purple. As he spoke to Bai Shanshui, his flying sword broke free of the entanglement of a bright white flying sword, broke through the roof, and passed through the body of a gray-robed old man. The moment the gray-robed old man's bloody mist surged, the small sword that had been drifting like a leaf in the ditch suddenly fell to the ground. Boom! The gray-robed old man fell like a mountain into a narrow space filled with junk. He looked at the fatal wound at his heart and shouted in discontent, "Fanjua is dead. Where did this person come from?" Looking at the young cultivator next to Bai Shanshui, who was barely visible in the darkness, everyone who had participated in the encirclement was similarly shocked and puzzled. No one knew that this young person came from the Chu. No one knew that his name was Li Yunrui. This nameless cultivator who had suddenly appeared was like heir to Chongling. Bai Shanshui did not care about Li Yunrui's flying sword. She looked up at the sky. Those white lines in the sky carried a pure and holy aura. They were actually a dozen heavenly fires condensed from the natural energies. Bai Shanshui was certain that the skyfire was the work of Zhang Xiu when she sensed the cold and perfect qi. However, what she found hard to understand was that although the skyfire was equally powerful, it seemed more deliberate and less natural compared to the qi she had sensed on the river before. It was a little stiff. Naturally, it was impossible for Zhang Xiu's cultivation to drop for no reason. To her, now was not the time to consider Zhang Xiu's cultivation. It was difficult for her to resist the power of these heavenly flames, but she had to block them. She stared at the cold heavenly flames and waved her sword again. A blue wave surged from her sword and then turned into a furious waterfall, rolling towards the sky. These dozen bolts of heavenly fire were supposed to fall at the same time towards her and Li Yunrui at her side. This was a power she could not fight against. However, as the waterfall flowed backwards, the dozen bolts of heavenly fire broke through the waves of the green waterfall. There was a clear distinction between who came first and who came first. Then the deep green life-bond sword disappeared from her hand. Her fingers flicked, and a dozen glowing droplets of liquid formed in the air to meet the dozen bolts of skyfire. Every collision was like a giant mountain colliding with each other. Countless chaotic heaven-earth yuan qi blossomed like fireworks. More than 10 houses around the small courtyard collapsed from top to bottom like paper. Bai Shanshui's face was extremely pale. She barely managed to block Zhang Xiu's skyfire. She felt proud, but at this time, she felt a warning. A black flying sword flew out from the broken tiles. This black flying sword was ordinary and did not have any unique aura. It was as ordinary as an ordinary broken tile. It did not attract any of her attention beforehand. She did not even sense it. It was not just simple, and its presence was restrained. This black flying sword had an extremely accurate grasp of timing, just like Ding Ning's winning moments at the Min Mountain Sword Trials. Even more importantly, this sword's murderousness was not directed at her, but at Li Yunrui next to her. She had no time to block with her sword. She felt very cold. There was a soft sound in the air. This was the sound of a sword passing through flesh. But this sword did not pierce Li Yunrui's body. Bai Shanshui's left arm was stretched out in front of Li Yunrui. This black, flying sword pierced through her left arm. Then, the owner of the flying sword knew she had won the time she needed. She did not continue to fly towards Li Yunrui. Instead, she suddenly let out a shrill howl and shot straight into the sky, as though she was about to fly beyond her control. Li Yunrui glanced at Bai Shanshui's left arm in front of him. He looked at the terrifying wound where blood was pouring out, but his expression did not change much. He did not look at the black flying sword that was just a fraction of a breath away from killing him. He nodded at Bai Shanshui and said, "Let's go." As the white skyfire fell, the strong murderousness in the surrounding streets retreated like a tide. The flying swords hidden in the darkness retreated like poisonous snakes. Bai Shanshui knew this was because of Li Yunrui's appearance. This cultivator who was absolutely unknown in Chongling had not been part of this situation. No one knew that such a powerful cultivator would appear next to her. Because of the appearance of such a powerful cultivator outside of the plan, Liang Lian could not lead his army to quickly kill or capture her in these streets. The longer they fought in these streets, the more ordinary people of Chongling would die. Any old person of Chongling, including Zhang Xiu's enemies like Bai Shanshui, knew the cruelty of this woman sitting in the empress seat. She would not care about paying a price. But Liang Lian could not bear such a price. Because the deaths of these people, these prices would not be counted on her in the future, but on Liang Lian. So at this moment, the net surrounding her and Li Yunrui loosened a little. This was a purposefully loosened gap. After they charged out, they did not know what was waiting for her and Li Yunrui outside. But as a great rebel, she did not even have the courage to try. "Let's go." She only calmly nodded her head and continued to follow behind Li Yunrui like a true attendant. Blood dripped down her arm. Then the color grew fainter. What dripped from her arm was no longer blood, but glowing water droplets. The glowing water droplets fell to the ground without any sound. They seeped through the cracks in the stone paths of Chongling streets and alleys and into the hard earth below. Yet, there was a rumbling like a drum from underground. The sound grew louder and more intense. All of Chongling started to shake. Many Qin dynasty cultivators hiding in the darkness looked in shock at the shaking ground. They could not understand how Bai Shanshui could cause such a result with her cultivation. Why is it like this? Li Yunrui could not understand either. He frowned slightly and could not help but ask softly. Bai Shanshui smiled rebelliously and said, "You have been following me. You should know that I have seen Chongling's water channels the most in these days. Underground rivers." Li Yunrui reacted. He appeared to be in a daze, but in reality, his mind was focused on his flying sword flying through the air. Causing the underground rivers to pulse is just too much of a waste of vital energy. The dust accumulated between the roof tiles fell down. Panicked voices sounded in the distant streets, followed by coughing. Lights lit up one by one. All of Chongling was awakened from their dreams. For someone like me, if I were to die, I would naturally die with a bang. How is it possible to kill me silently? Hearing Li Yunrui's words, Bai Shanshui's lips curled into a proud smile. So what if I spend more vital energy to wake up Chongling? Li Yunrui glanced at her and did not speak. Bai Shanshui knew that he felt she was too conceited and arrogant at this time, but she showed an even prouder smile. Starting now, follow me. If those two do not appear, if we can stop Zhang Xiu's sword, we may be able to leave this city alive. Li Yunrui's brow furrowed slightly. He wanted to say that leaving this city alive did not mean much to him. But sensing the tremors coming from the ground, he heard something unusual in Bai Shanshui's words. Or rather, he heard vitality. This vitality was important to her, at least. Chapter 320. Dogs barked and chickens cried. All of Chongling was restless, but many people remained seated. Bureau Chief Yi Sealing of the Bureau of Astrology sat on the covered bridge at the north end of Swallowtail Alley. The river under the covered bridge was unusually restless. Transparent bubbles kept bubbling out of the mud and floated to the surface of the water. The waves splashed against the stone pillars under the covered bridge. Her expression was calm, as if she did not care at all. On the stone bridge next to her, there were open black umbrellas. The officials of the Bureau of Astrology in black robes were holding black umbrellas to cover their bodies in the darkness. They were packed together and spread from the stone bridge to the streets behind. Bai Shanshui suddenly stopped in her steps. She did not walk towards the alley ahead and turned towards an alley to the east. Li Yunrui did not hesitate to follow her. He frowned and said, "Bureau of Astrology?" Bai Shanshui nodded. Li Yunrui looked at her proud profile and said after a moment of silence, "Why not go from there? That may be the weakest. Since Zhang Xiu has acted, and the entire Bureau of Astrology is waiting there. Even if we can get out of there, what happens next will not be so simple." Bai Shanshui smiled. "If you have to risk your life, you do not have to find a person you find pleasing to the eye." After a pause, Bai Shanshui did not look at Li Yunrui and said, "In Chongling, it is very difficult to find a few pleasing to the eye." Li Yunrui shook his head. "If you really have such intentions, you should go to her. Back then, she was unable to stop you on the Wei River. Today, you are not going to pass through there. Other people may think that she is colluding with you great rebels. Her situation in Chongling will be even more difficult in the future. Back then, today, in the future." Bai Shanshui turned to look at him with slight disdain. "I just find her pleasing to the eye. Who cares about the future? I just want to be happy right now. As to whether she lives or dies, she is Qin and has nothing to do with me." Li Yunrui had never seen such reasoning and stilled. Bai Shanshui's expression suddenly grew grave. She looked into the distance. There was a towering turret in the darkness. There were no lights on the turret, but she could feel an abnormally lofty aura rising from that corner. The turret became larger and larger in her perception. "It's Emo Shoucheng." Li Yunrui also felt that strange and powerful presence. He raised his head and spoke softly in that direction. Then, he turned towards the west in a very natural manner. Only that old man could emit such an aura, which was a warning to him and Bai Shanshui. If he and Bai Shanshui ignored the warning and continued to move in that direction, that abnormally high power would truly sweep down, ignoring the streets and alleys. If he tried, he would die. Thus, he and Bai Shui could not test whether or not the old man would really attack at all costs. At this moment, if they did not want to turn back and fight to the death with Liang Lian's army, then they could only go to the west. At this time, their west was the closest path to the outskirts of Chongling, and there was a tributary of the Wei River in the outskirts. Bai Shui did not object and followed Li Yunrui's figure. At this time, there were no flying swords attacking. The two walked side by side, and it was impossible to see who was the other's attendant. There is a large reed marsh there. In the past, many ordinary criminals of Chongling thought they could escape easily if they ran there, but they all died there. So that reed marsh is called the Dead Marsh. Bai Shui gathered her messy long hair and said casually to Li Yunrui. She found that she was not used to female makeup. A very appropriate name. Li Yunrui turned to glance at her and said in an even more serious tone, "You are very beautiful right now, so I will not let you fall into their hands. If you cannot escape, I will definitely kill you before they catch you." Bai Shui stilled slightly and understood what he meant. If a woman like her fell into the water prison of Chongling, what she would experience would be more terrifying than a man. But she smiled unconcernedly and said, "Thank you for your praise." The ground was still shaking, and the roof tiles and beams were creaking. However, the dangerous aura they sensed was fading away, and everything became eerily quiet. No one stopped them. Like a pair of lovers watching a lantern festival, the two strolled through the streets in the night. I became a sword cultivator. In these years, only my senior sect brother followed me. I did not even have a close male friend. The atmosphere was astoundingly oppressive, but Bai Shui did not care. She looked at the dim shadows on the stone path and said casually, "In the past, if a man dared to say something like this to me, even if I did not kill him, I would have dug out his eyes." Li Yunrui frowned slightly. He felt Bai Shui was ruthless. But thinking of her previous situation and how she wanted people to feel she was powerful and dangerous, he bowed his head slightly and did not speak. "But when I think of how I am about to die, and have never had a true companion, and have never understood true love between men and women, it is a pity." Bai Shui laughed again and said, "When a young girl first awakened to love, I had fantasized that if someone could disregard their life to protect me, I would disregard everything to like him. Although my senior apprentice brother has fought alongside me all these years, he is still only my senior apprentice brother. Moreover, my cultivation has always been above his. Most of the time, I am the one protecting him. Today, you are the first man to risk his life to protect me." Hearing this, Li Yunrui's breathing stopped and his body tensed. "Since you feel I am pretty, if we can charge out today and not die, we can try to start." Bai Shui pursed her lips and said naturally, "What try to start?" Li Yunrui, who had disregarded life and death when he was in the killing formation, changed expression and shouted. He turned and saw Bai Shui's teasing smile. He was immediately annoyed and said angrily, "You are still joking with me at a time like this?" Bai Shui laughed loudly without any ladylike demeanor. Many breaths later, she put away her smile and said, "Bai Shui, do not go back on my words. When have you ever heard me joke?" Li Yunrui was stunned. He thought of this person's life, but could not think of anything to say in response. His face flushed red, and he forced out the word from between his teeth, "Boring." "Boring?" Bai Shui smiled soundlessly. In this life, she feared she had never been as interesting or as dangerous as today. Li Yunrui turned his head away, unwilling to speak to Bai Shui. There were no more sounds in the streets. The dead were still far away, but Bai Shui could feel the moisture coming from the reeds. A flute sounded among the reeds. Someone was playing a flute in the dead. The sound of the flute was indistinct, so slow that it was almost out of tune. It was clearly summer, but it sounded like the wailing of autumn insects, weakly flapping their wings and unable to fly up into the sky from the reed leaves that covered the sky. Yet this kind of flute had astounding penetrating power. It passed through many miles of farmland, through many streets, and clearly reached Bai Shui and Li Yunrui's ears. Li Yunrui, who had decided not to speak to Bai Shui, took a deep breath and could not help but ask coldly, "Who is it?" "Chief Inspector Chen, that mysterious warden of the Divinity Bureau." Bai Shanshui's words split into two brief moments. Li Yunrui heard the shock in her voice. In the next moment, Bai Shanshui ran her fingers through her hair and smiled. "Interesting. Let's go through there. Of these people in Chongling, he is the only one I have not seen fight." "You have seen the others fight?" Li Yunrui frowned and said in disbelief, "You may not believe it. Many times, I did not show up, but that does not mean I was not there." Bai Shanshui put her hands behind her back and looked coolly at him. She said, "Do not forget, when my dynasty was destroyed, I was already a great rebel. My dynasty has been destroyed for many years, and before that, I was already on many battlefields." Li Yunrui bowed his head. Bai Shanshui's experiences were not something ordinary cultivators could compare to. But, while mystery was interesting, it also meant unpredictability and power. If he had a choice, he would rather face another powerful woman in Chongling and her entire astrology bureau than face the mysterious chief of the bureau who was waiting for them in the Dead Man Sweep. Bai Shanshui walked with her hands behind her back. He silently followed with a bowed head. "Other than my senior sect brother, you are the first man who does not care about life and death, and follows me regardless of whether I am leading the way to life or death." Bai Shanshui's voice reached his ears again. Li Yunrui grew angry again and said in a heavier tone, "So boring." "Boring?" Bai Shanshui responded coolly this time. "I just do not want you to be filled with death. If you have no interest in life, how can you help me survive?" Chapter 321. Li Yunrui turned her head away, annoyed. The faint smile on Bai Shanshui's face immediately disappeared, and she sighed. Because she was more arrogant and vicious in her actions than the cultivators of the sword furnace, even if she had not fought in Chang'e last year, she was the greatest rebel in the eyes of almost everyone in the Qin dynasty. She had become famous early and famous. Her opponent was the strongest in the world. As she grew older, she naturally developed a presence that looked down on the world. Even though her cultivation was damaged right now, and her vital energy was not as good as ordinary Realm 7 cultivators, facing her presence, many ordinary Realm 7 cultivators would cower before the battle. They would be weaker in terms of sword essence and could not match her. However, as a great grandmaster, all she had done in the past many years was either refining swords, escaping, or killing people. She drifted like duckweed and did not have many beautiful memories to reminisce about. There were also many things that she wanted to do but did not have the time to do. She spoke so much now because she did not have much confidence that she could survive tonight. If she died here, she would have many regrets. The sound of the flute in the reed marsh was always faint, and the same when they were close. It was like the catkins in the spring, barely discernible but not clear. It made people feel uncomfortable. This patch of reeds known as the Dead Man's Marsh was indeed very large. It was a boundless expanse that seemed to extend to the horizon. While Chongling has a large population, the ratio of cultivators, swordsmen, and armies far surpasses any city. In other eras recorded in the history books, this is militaristic. While Yuan Wu is relying on the Shang reform, the situation is stable, taxes are strict, and Guangzhou is 800 miles of fertile land. The output of each mu of land and the number of people that can be supported is much greater than other dynasties. If this balance is broken, Yuan Wu will have a harder time than other dynasties. Pity that the people of the Bazin Kendo ground back then were too strong, and we were too weak. We did not even work together once, so the three dynasties were destroyed so easily. Passing through the streets and alleys, they seemed to follow the guidance of the flute. No one stopped them along the way. Bai Shanshui looked at the reeds that were already in front of them and spoke calmly to Li Yunrui beside him. Li Yunrui listened to these words that were not boring to him. After a moment of silence, he said, "1/10 of the Qin dynasty died in their prime. How can this be considered easy?" Although many died, there were also many who surrendered. Bai Shanshui sneered and said, 100 died and 80 took in. When the three dynasties were destroyed, the Qin did not just expand their territory. Even the population of Chongling more than doubled in a few short years. Is it because men and women are fertile in Chongling? Li Yunrui was silent again. Then she said with true admiration, "Not everyone has your courage. Most people just go with the flow in the end." Neither of them turned around. However, they didn't need to turn their heads. With their cultivation, they could clearly sense that countless soldiers wearing black armor had silently surged out from the originally silent streets behind them. These soldiers in heavy armor moved nimbly. The metallic light on their bodies filled all the cracks in the streets behind them. They were like two ants in front of a black tide, but still chatting and laughing. Bai Shanshui was arrogant, but in reality, he was a very cautious person. If they had moved away some of the Chongling residents in advance, Bai Shanshui would have detected them long ago. The Qin dynasty people in the streets were a protective talisman for the two of them. Even the teacher of the Holy Son of Heaven, Emo Shouqing, whose cultivation was far above Bai Shanshui's, purposefully showed a presence on a distant turret. He acted as if he would not attack as long as Bai Shanshui did not pass in that direction and stayed away from the ordinary people of Chongling. So according to Li Yunrui's judgment, charging out from the astrology bureau led by Yi Xiling had been the best choice. Now that they were moving along the path the enemy had planned and away from the back streets, they did not even have the last protective talisman. If we are able to escape today, please do not misunderstand. Li Yunrui sensed the cold metal presence behind him. He hesitated for a moment and then said solemnly, "I am just carrying out my mission." Bai Shanshui glanced at him and nodded. "You are loyal to the king's orders. But even if you seek death, you can choose who you want to die with." Li Yunrui was silent for a moment and then slowly said, "In truth, at least, I admire you. So I hope you can live." Bai Shanshui laughed. Then she looked seriously at Li Yunrui and said, "Cultivators at your level will often be obsessed with simple and crude power. They will casually use a sword move that causes the primal energies of the universe to explode. The feeling of using absolute power to crush an opponent is hard to resist. There are very few people like you who can control your desires and cultivate such fine flying sword arts. So you are the cultivator who uses flying swords the best I have seen in recent years. In the future, I will still be your attendant." Hearing her words, Li Yunrui's expression quickly became solemn. It was not because of the meaning contained in Bai Shanshui's words, but because at this moment, the reeds in front of them were giving off dangerous presences and a unique stench. A wild wind blew out of the reeds. Then there were violent sounds. Many green reeds exploded into pieces of grass that flew into the air with the wind. Among the wild wind and debris, there were shrill screams and black shadows passed through. Li Yunrui looked up, solemnly and calmly at the black night sky. Then the fingers of his right hand trembled slightly. There was a soft hiss. His flying sword flew out of nowhere and pierced through the oncoming wind and debris. In the next moment, there was a thick mist of blood among the wild wind and debris, and large balls of black feathers flying. A heavy black shadow fell like a meteor in front of him and Bai Shanshui. This was a very strange bird. Its entire body was covered in black feathers, like a crane. However, its body was several times larger than the largest eagle. Its eyes were blood red like beautiful rubies, and its disheveled black feathers were surrounded by an agile aura, as if there was wind flowing within it. However, the moment this strange bird fell, dozens of similar strange birds had already descended, covering the sky and covering the sun. Bai Shanshui narrowed her eyes and looked up. She was certain that the sharp claws of these birds were no less than the 100 refined swords of ordinary Chongling swordsmen. Also, these birds gathered primal energies of the universe, and each bird was much faster than ordinary birds. Each and every one of them was like a flying sword. But she still had no intentions of attacking, and just watched silently. In a flash, fine wounds appeared on the necks of the dozens of birds. The blood turned into a mist, and the bright red flesh squeezed out of the enlarged wounds, and then revealed white bones. The dozens of birds were in extreme pain, their bodies twisting wildly in the air and spinning as they fell down. After the dozens of birds, countless black shadows flew out of the wild wind and debris. The red flashes in their eyes made the night sky seem to be filled with red gems. Bai Shanshui bowed her head. She looked at the messy ground in front of her. The sewage and mud gave off unusual vibrations. Her eyes shone brightly, and then she unhesitatingly attacked with her sword. A dark green lifebond sword flew out. There was no waterfall of dark green sword light in front of her, and no water vapor gathered in the sky. But the sewage between the broken reeds in front of her rippled even more violently. Small scale-like waves rose up, but did not fall down. They started to give off sharp sword essences. These motionless waves were like countless sharp swords erected on the ground. Pew, 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 pew. The sound of countless sharp blades slicing through flesh and disemboweling rang out. Many black and sticky silhouettes, whose bodies were covered in mud, were writhing on the ground in an even more painful manner than those strange birds. While they were moving swiftly, their bellies had long been cut into pieces. At this moment, their bodies were writhing madly, and their bodies were shredded into countless pieces, which were beyond recognition. Even Li Yunrui had to spend a long time to see that the figures rolling in the mud were enormous black, lizard-like beasts. Their bodies were as smooth as catfish, and their skin looked tough and elastic. If they had not been moving quickly against the sharp water blades, the blades of ordinary swordsmen would not have been able to cut through their skin. When did the Qin army start to use such tactics? He shook his head in puzzlement and asked Bai Shanshui next to him. It is not easy to cultivate these beasts. These beasts are more useful in battle. Why waste so much to deal with us? A cold smile appeared on Bai Shanshui's face. She glanced at Li Yunrui and said, "Now I understand why Zhengxiu forced us here." Chapter 322. Who is that young person? Imo Shoqing looked at Chongling that had woken up. His wise and experienced gaze looked towards the alley that Bai Shanshui and Li Yunrui had charged out of. He gently and slowly asked a black-armored general who had just appeared behind him. The black-armored general bowed respectfully to the old man sitting on the old rattan chair. Then he reported, "The bureaus have no leads on this person." Imo Shoqing thought and said, "Try to keep him alive." The black-armored general's expression grew ugly. But if they wanted to keep a great rebel like Bai Shanshui alive, they would have to pay a great price. Adding on that young man who seemed to have fallen from the sky and whose flying sword arts were unfathomable, who knew how many soldiers and cultivators would die tonight. But he was certain that this old man had weighed the cost when he said this. Then the price was worth it. Therefore, he solemnly bowed again and promised, yes, a very good flying sword, a very patient flying sword. Not many of the young people in Chongling have the patience to cultivate flying swords. Imo Shoqing listened to the footsteps of the general leaving behind him and said softly to himself with pity. The turret was still trembling slightly. The rattan chair under him suddenly gave off soft cracking sounds. Old rattan chairs, old bamboo mats. The older they were, the more comfortable they would be to sit and lie down. But when they were too old, they would easily rot and break. In the past, this old rattan chair that he was used to sitting on would easily break, but this year, it had broken many times. Imo Shoqing shook his head softly and felt it was inauspicious. What is the meaning? Li Yunrui turned to look at Bai Shanshui and asked. His brow was furrowed, but not because of this problem. In a situation like this where he felt he would die, he did not care about this problem. What made him uncomfortable was the pungent smell of blood and flesh from the Qin army's tamed beasts. You can't even get used to the smell of blood. It seems you have not had much experience in cruel fighting. Bai Shanshui seemed to see the source of his displeasure. He smiled mockingly and then continued, "Many things, including battle formations and new artifacts, have to be tested in real combat after being created. The stronger the weapon, the more it has to be used against powerful cultivators." Li Yunrui quickly understood Bai Shanshui's meaning and said, "So she is using us as testing tools? A test tool like me is too hard to come by." Bai Shanshui laughed coldly and arrogantly. "She wants to send a message to me and the world with such an arrangement. Even a great rebel like me is just a tool for her to practice tactics and test new weapons in her eyes. Looks like you're right. She doesn't consider things on the same level as us at all." Li Yunrui raised her head. At this moment, the black feathers and scarlet blood that were falling from the sky suddenly thickened. The dense blood fell into the mud and even made the sound of a rainstorm. It was not because his flying sword had sped up at this moment. His flying sword was the same as Emo Shocheng's evaluation. He used the most patient fighting method. Each blow was just right and did not waste any vital energy. At this time, it was because the wild birds in the sky started to tear at each other even more furiously. Angry shouts and shouts could be heard from the distant reeds, but they could not stop the birds from rioting on their own. This kind of presence even affected the beasts in the surrounding mud. The beasts started to panic. They did not bite each other, but feared this battlefield. Some started to flee into the surrounding reeds. I heard that Min Mountain Sword Sect has a demon farm. Zhang Xiao and Yuan Wu want to learn from Min Mountain Sword Sect. Zhang Xiao must feel that this is good. These animals can appear on the battlefield and show the other dynasties the new power of Chongling. But it is a pity that she is too optimistic. Bai Shanshui laughed loudly. Have these animals never even encountered a true killing star and can only scare those mediocre people? Li Yunrui glanced at her and shook his head. He said, no meaning. Bai Shanshui glanced back at him and said, interesting, because if they can hear us, they will pass it along to Zhang Xiao's ears. Li Yunrui was silent for a moment and said, but we will still die in the end. What is the meaning in this kind of mockery before death? Bai Shanshui laughed with a teasing tone. What if we can leave this place alive? Li Yunrui did not respond to her. He looked up at the night sky and said softly, they are here. The black birds that had almost covered the entire sky had already dissipated in their frenzied rampage, leaving behind countless clusters of hot, bloody aura. At this moment, the night sky was like a black curtain painted with blood, and on this curtain, there were already countless gorgeous, dark green streams of light. The moment Li Yunrui said the words, these flowing lights had crossed hundreds of feet and arrived in the air above him and Bai Shanshui. The beautiful and agile green flowing lights were like arrows. Before they could land on the ground, they began to disintegrate in midair. No primal energies of the universe reached the ground. There was only a high-frequency vibration from these broken arrows. There was an inaudible sound that covered the surroundings. Bai Shanshui's pupils contracted. Her watery eyes and exceptionally pale face immediately showed red light. These red lights were not caused by the flow of blood, but the rupture of many small pores. The vital energy and blood in her body, even though they flowed under her control, vibrated strangely. A wave of death energy spread from the depths of her body towards the surface of her skin. She could not resist this kind of power. She felt as though her body was about to shatter into pieces. At this time, Li Yunrui's hand landed on her shoulder. His hand also began to vibrate at an extremely high frequency. In this moment, Bai Shanshui left the shadow of death. Why is it like this? While the discomfort rippling through her body made Bai Shanshui want to vomit, she immediately took a deep breath and asked Li Yunrui. To know the solution meant that Li Yunrui knew of this terrifying weapon long ago and had a deep understanding of it. Sound seal arrow. Li Yunrui's expression was uglier than Bai Shanshui's. He struggled to say in a voice that only he and Bai Shanshui could hear. My dynasty has studied this kind of weapon for decades, but we have not made any breakthroughs. This kind of seal weapon is not hard to defeat for powerful cultivators who know its principles, but for cultivators and soldiers who do not have enough vital energy, it is a disaster. Bai Shanshui frowned. She could understand Li Yunrui's feelings right now. The Chu dynasty was the strongest in weapon-making in the world, and the foundation of their standing. Before Yuanwu ascended the throne, the Qin army's fighting style could be said to be based on the sword, and they fought for the world with the sword. Even after 3 years of Yuanwu, Chongling started to build workshops to make weapons, but no matter how much wealth and resources they invested, they could not compare to the workshops of the Chu dynasty. In the previous Deer Mountain Conference, the Qin dynasty had shown some powerful seal weapons to the other 3 dynasties. Those arrows with flames that could melt stone, and these sound seal arrows that surpassed the Chu dynasty, it was easy to deduce a conclusion. The price Li Lingjun had paid to return to his homeland and become king was far greater than the world had imagined. He had even sold out the interests of the entire Chu dynasty. She knew that Li Yunrui was most worried about how the people of the Chu dynasty would react to the new emperor after what happened here passed back to the Chu dynasty, and what kind of turmoil would occur. This was truly killing many birds with one stone. Zhang Xiu's every move has great meaning. In terms of cunning and scheming, I think no one can compare to her. Bai Shanshui's breathing had completely stabilized. Just now, the line between life and death did not seem to affect her at all. She sneered and said, "Countless people have suffered at her hands. You do not have to worry too much about your new emperor." Li Yunrui raised an eyebrow. He did not respond. It was not because he could not detect the good intentions in Bai Shanshui's words, but because the sound of the flute that had been faintly reaching his ears had suddenly disappeared. The moment the sound of the flute stopped, a pale white sword light with an indescribable murderousness floated out of the wind. Li Yunrui's flying sword broke through the wind and met the pale white flying sword. The two small swords changed positions in the air, but did not truly touch each other. Then they flew back. Bai Shanshui did not look at the pale white flying sword, and calmly looked forward. Amidst the mud and reeds mixed with countless pieces of flesh, a man in dark red robes slowly appeared in her and Li Yunrui's line of sight. Looking at this thin but uncomfortable man, Bai Shanshui said with slight disdain, "So you can use flying swords so well?" Li Yunrui's expression grew grave. The man in crimson robes was naturally the mysterious head of the Divinity Bureau. "Not from the Qin, but your flying sword is better than almost all the swordsmen in Chongling. It is not easy for you." Bai Shanshui looked at the silent Chief Inspector Chen and said disdainfully. Li Yunrui stilled and could not help but turn to look at Bai Shanshui. He usually did not travel outside, so he did not know some secrets. Chief Inspector Chen, who had been sitting in a carriage or in a dark hall all year round, so his face was unusually pale, slowly looked up. He glanced at Bai Shanshui, and then at the pale white flying sword that had flown back to him. He said coolly, "It is not easy, so my flying sword is called the Thin Life Sword." Hearing his voice, Li Yunrui's gaze involuntarily landed on the sword. That sword was as pale and thin as paper. Thin as paper, the name of the sword was appropriate. Chapter 323. Bai Shanshui glanced at the paper-white flying sword and said coolly to Li Yunrui, "He is yours." Li Yunrui frowned slightly but did not say anything. She nodded slowly. A proud smile appeared on Bai Shanshui's lips. "No matter what, follow me." Then she turned. The moment she turned, countless torches lit up in the darkness as though the entire border of Chongling facing her started to burn. In the burning sea of fire, a cultivator with a body like cast iron walked out of the crowd with firm and almost constant steps. Bai Shanshui sneered. "Liang Lian, I was just about to find you. You dare to come find me?" Liang Lian's expression did not change. His black boots stepped steadily on the ground. Black earth splashed out from under his feet like blooming black lotuses. The laughable pride of the Qin. Bai Shanshui looked at the silent Liang Lian and mocked even more harshly. "Even if it is soldier against soldier, general against general, you do not qualify. Where is Shan Xian? Why does he not dare to come see me?" Liang Lian still did not respond. He continued to walk dozens of feet with steady steps and then calmly reached out with his right hand. There was an explosion in the world. An extremely pure life-bound item's aura filled many people's senses. A streak of black light extended outwards like an extension of his arm, forming a straight, jet-black broadsword. Half of the sword's body was thick and gloomy, like the jet-black stones by the riverside, while the other half was rippling like thousands of turbid waves. He held the sword across his chest and then said coldly, "Please." Then he attacked without any hesitation. Vast amounts of primal energies of the universe flooded into his life-bond sword. A curved dam seemed to appear around his body. His body and the life-bond sword in his hand gave off more and more power, but this power kept accumulating in the river bank. This sword was the strongest move of the cofferdam sword manual he had used against Xue Wangshu in the past, the dam-breaching sword. The essence of this sword was to continuously accumulate power, and when the dam finally broke, all the power would burst forth. In the past, when Shui Wangshu faced this sword, he used the white goat hanging horn to stop the dam from breaching. Even if it breached, he did not let the water flow towards him, but towards the two sides. Facing such a sword, Bai Shanshui smiled even more mockingly. Using such a sword move against me, you have probably forgotten that I am the Cloud Water Palace Master. She didn't attack first, but waited. Liang Lian raised his eyebrows slightly. The night clouds in the sky suddenly became chaotic, and the sword was formed. A terrible roar sounded in front of him, and the invisible dam broke. A violent and domineering force blasted out, rushing towards Bai Shanshui. Due to the backlash of the heaven and earth primordial qi, the flames on the torches of all the soldiers standing behind Liang Lian were pulled back at the same time, making whooshing noises. The power and momentum of this sword could be said to be perfect, as if it was not a power of the mortal world. But facing such a sword, Bai Shanshui didn't even draw his sword. Her left hand stroked the air. Several sparkling and translucent water droplets flew out from her fingertips like sparkling and translucent pearls, and then turned into several ribbons of sparkling and translucent water. These streams of water appeared minuscule compared to the violent wave coming from the dam. But when the two met, the violent and domineering wave could not advance, and started to spin dozens of feet in front of her. An enormous and rapidly spinning water whirlpool appeared in front of her like a building. Many of the Chongling cultivators in the darkness were silent. Chief Inspector Qin's voice sounded at this time. The light of the fire at the border of Chongling could not reach so far. Under the light of the distant fire, this bureau chief of the Divinity Bureau, who usually did not show himself, appeared even darker and colder. But his expression still had an indescribable sense of decadence. In the past, no one in the world could surpass the way Cloud Water Palace in controlling water. Now, no one can surpass Palace Master Bai. He looked at Li Yunrui, who was looking at him, and said in a low but clear voice, "But have you ever thought why General Yang, who has been through hundreds of battles, would use such a sword move in front of Palace Master Bai?" Li Yunrui looked calmly at him and said, "I do not want to, because that has nothing to do with me." The moment he said the first word, two invisible sword lights flashed in the darkness between him and Chief Inspector Chen. Then a blinding spark bloomed. Two flying swords emerged from the sparks, each carrying a trembling and fluctuating air wave. If Li Yunrui was a bit distracted, or his emotions fluctuated a bit, he may be dead now. Chief Inspector Chen frowned deeply. He was certain that this unknown young person in Chongling was a rare and powerful enemy. Bai Shanshui's brow furrowed deeply as she easily resolved Liang Lian's domineering sword with her left hand. She put away her scornful and disdainful smile and said with a frown, "Even Shui Wangshu is not a match. How can you be so strong?" Liang Lian looked at the spinning whirlpool. There was no other expression on his face other than indifference. "Why do I have to appear stronger than Shui Wangshu?" Following his words, several muffled and loud explosions resounded between heaven and earth once again. The first explosion that sounded like a landmine came from beneath his feet. The tough black leather combat boots he wore exploded into pieces. The wet and soft soil of the reed swamp became harder and firmer than the stone roads of Chongling as his feet hammered down with the terrifying power contained in his feet. Even though his feet were like metal, as he exerted force, his flesh split and blood sprayed out. Two deep red footprints appeared under him. His body seemed to pass through space and appeared behind the spinning whirlpool. The life-bond sword in his right hand stabbed towards the spinning whirlpool, but the second muffled explosion came from his sword hilt. His left fist hammered hard on his sword hilt. A terrifying force passed through the sword hilt and into the blade. The wave seal scripts on half of his life-bond sword seemed to be sent flying and charged forward along the domineering sword essence. The third deep rumble rang out without any pause. The towering whirlpool immediately collapsed. Countless waves turned into countless swords, pressing against the air in front of them like mountains and walls pressing towards Bai Shanshui. There were swords in front of Bai Shanshui. Tens of thousands of swords filled the sky in front of her. But the most terrifying thing was the sword that looked like a black rock, with its seal scripts fading away. Tens of thousands of water swords moved through the air. The primal energies of the universe produced by the sword path all gathered into Liang Lian's sword. Bai Shanshui attacked. The long sword in her hand, which was as deep as a jade pond, also stabbed forward. The primal energies of the universe on the sword started to flow. Just a few feet forward, the tens of thousands of water swords in front of her melted like snow, turning back into glowing water and then forming a wall. A glowing water wall appeared between her and Liang Lian. Liang Lian's expression did not change. He still silently stabbed with his sword and did not change his stance. The black sword tip and the glowing water wall collided and gave off another muffled explosion. The water wall collapsed and spread outwards. The black sword tip continued to advance and then encountered Bai Shanshui's deep green sword tip. When the two sword tips met, a dot of starlight lit up like a small star was forming. Liang Lian's breathing stopped. A muffled grunt came from his tightly pressed lips. His entire body turned the color of black metal. A layer of light flashed on the surface of his skin like a sword, and then his body stopped. A circle of air exploded around his body, and the ground rippled outwards. Bai Shanshui's body flew backwards wrapped in the wave of energy. She hit the ground hard and then bounced into the air like a white stone. Countless cracking sounds came from behind her. The reeds swaying in the wild wind were crushed by the sword energy coming from her body. The pieces danced like snow. The moment she bounced up from the ground, Bai Shanshui had already controlled her body. While her body was still flying backwards, she maintained a standing posture. However, several strands of blood seeped out from her tightly pursed lips. Her face was pale, and her white robes were exceptionally white in the night. The lines of blood that fell on the white robes were especially eye-catching. 5 pale sword shadows circled around Li Yunrui's body like wild bees dancing in a frenzy. 5 cracks appeared on Li Yunrui's robes. Faint lines of blood seeped out of the cracks. "So you are so strong." Bureau Chief Chun still had a strange sense of decadence as he looked up slightly and said. No one knew if he was speaking to Li Yunrui, who had managed to block this attack and only suffered some flesh wounds, or to Liang Lian, who had sent Bai Shanshui flying with one blow. Even as he spoke, Liang Lian still held his sword coldly and looked at Bai Shanshui in the air. Looking at his back that was as cold as iron, all the soldiers behind him woke up from their shock. They finally understood why their general had been so cold and unchanged after losing to Shui Wangxiu. They also finally understood why this general had not been outstanding among his former colleagues, but had been able to survive several battles where only a few people had survived. Because he was willing to lose. The same 2 swords showed completely different power. General Yang was stronger than many people had imagined. Chapter 324. Bai Shanshui landed on the ground again. With the terrifying impact, her feet plowed out 2 deep gullies in the muddy ground. Her right sleeve was completely torn. Blood and energy wrapped around her jade-white arm, burning like a bright red flame. She looked up and started to cough. Blood seeped out of the corners of her bright lips, but her expression grew colder. "You have won this blow. If this was any other time, I would admit defeat. But tonight, we are not competing, but deciding life and death." When this voice sounded, the ground under her feet suddenly sank silently, forming a perfect circular pit. Then her figure disappeared from it. She started to run towards Liang Lian. Perfect circular pits continuously appeared in the ground. Anyone could imagine the terrifying power contained in them. Yet, there was no sound. Countless fine lines of water seeped out of the earth and flew up under the pressure of the great power. It started to rain in the space Bai Shanshui passed through. Yet, this rain came from the ground to the sky, filled with a heaven-defying presence. Li Yunrui looked up and calmly looked at the dispirited chief inspector in the darkness ahead. He asked seriously, "You want to die with me?" At the same time, the flying sword in front of him started to accelerate. A straight sword path appeared in the air between him and Chief Inspector Chen. His flying sword flew in a straight path towards Chief Inspector Chen's throat. Before this, His flying sword had always been on an erratic path, making it hard for people to catch its trajectory. Now, it was flying in a straight line. Everyone found that his flying sword was very fast. Sensing the sword essence of this blow, Chief Inspector Chun narrowed his eyes slightly. However, he did not call back his flying sword. As his right hand moved slightly, his flying sword also flew straight forward, brushing past Li Yunrui's flying sword, and also pointed straight at Li Yunrui's throat. In this moment, an old figure appeared from the reeds behind him. He drew his sword, and a gray sword light with a moldy presence slashed towards Li Yunrui's flying sword. This was not a sword competition, but a life and death battle. So at certain moments, Chief Inspector Chin did not need to rely on his own power to deal with Li Yunrui's flying sword. He also had attendants, and his attendants were more powerful than ordinary attendants. Liang Lian's eyes narrowed into thin lines. Looking at Bai Shanshui charging at him at a terrifying speed, he could not understand. But he did not hesitate. His chiseled brows slowly rose. Then he raised his life-bond sword to its limit and smashed it down towards the string of afterimages of Bai Shanshui. There was a muffled boom. Although it was a sword move, it smashed towards Bai Shanshui like a giant stick covering the sky. All the afterimages disappeared. The rain that flew up into the sky was instantly destroyed by the enormous power. Bai Shanshui's figure appeared. Her robes were pulled back to the extreme, and her proud figure could be seen at a glance. Her sword that was slashing towards Liang Lian was forcefully smashed to the ground, and her body was also forcefully smashed to the ground, retreating backwards. A trace of coldness appeared in Liang Lian's eyes. He calmly took a step forward and raised the sword in his hand again. However, it was also at this moment that his pupils rapidly contracted. Bai Shanshui retreated 10 steps. Each step she took landed in the perfect circular pit she had made previously. With every step he took, a white spray sprayed out from every pit. The 10 white waves charged towards Liang Lian. Liang Lian shouted and brought his sword down horizontally. The 10 white waves overlapped and hit the sword light in front of him. The 10 enormous powers overlapped and vibrated from the sword to his body. Liang Lian's body flashed with black metal light. But when the 7th great power hit his sword, he could not withstand it. With a grunt, his body flew backwards. Before his body landed on the ground, he spat out a mouthful of blood. The gray sword light that gave off a moldy presence accurately hit Li Yunrui's flying sword. But in this moment, Li Yunrui's flying sword split into 2. The 2 flying swords seemed to be alive as they sliced towards the arteries on the sides of Chief Inspector Chen's neck. An incredulous shout came out of the old figure's mouth. The gray sword light brought along a series of afterimages, wanting to cut down the 2 flying swords in one fell swoop. However, with a clang, this gray sword light was only able to knock away one of the flying swords before it was jolted into the air. On the other hand, the other flying sword seemed to be infused with even more power as it moved forward at an even faster speed. Chief Inspector Chin's body flew to the side. When Li Yunrui's flying sword naturally split into 2, his body had already flown to the side. At the same time, the flying sword flying towards Li Yunrui gave off a shrill howl and circled back with a wild presence. But both the body's movement and the sword's return could not keep up with the speed of Li Yunrui's flying sword. In a fraction of a second, the cold presence coming off the flying sword touched Chief Inspector Chin's skin and seeped into the arteries under his skin. Seeing that it was impossible to block such a sword, Chief Inspector Chin's face turned ashen. But there was no terror in his eyes. His pupils became absolutely empty. His long hair danced on the flying sword. His broken hair scattered. The flying sword still flew forward. The primal energies of the universe dancing between the broken hair bought Chief Inspector Chen a moment. His body straightened slightly, and then he used his collarbone to meet the flying sword. His body was thin, and his collarbone was like a long and narrow blade. With a crack, his collarbone broke. The flying sword flew up and still wanted to cut the arteries in his neck. But at this time, his wild flying sword finally arrived. In this moment, the tip of the sword brushed against the tail of Li Yunrui's flying sword. A blast of energy and blue flames bloomed. Li Yunrui's flying sword bent down and left another bone deep wound on Chief Inspector Chen's left shoulder. The old attendant with the gray sword light roared madly and swung his sword again. Li Yunrui's flying sword had already burrowed into the earth below. In an instant, it rushed out with a cloud of mud dozens of feet away. His hair was cut, his collarbone was broken, and his shoulder was wounded to the bone. Chief Inspector Chen was covered in blood, and his presence was weak. Li Yunrui did not look pleased after seriously injuring the mysterious bureau chief, whose status was above the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. The remaining half of his sword flew back with him. At this time, Bai Shanshui was charging towards Liang Lian again. Blood seeped out of her body due to the violent vibrations. Bloody clouds shrouded her, but a perfect pit appeared under her feet again. At this time, Chief Inspector Chen and Liang Lian were both seriously injured. Theoretically, Bai Shanshui should have turned around and charged out with Li Yunrui from Chief Inspector Chen's side. Liang Lian still had an army behind him and many powerful Chongling swordsmen. Even if they could kill Liang Lian, even if they could charge past the army, they would just charge back into Chongling. What was the meaning? Li Yunrui still could not understand Bai Shanshui's actions, but he remembered that Bai Shanshui had told him to follow her. He chose to trust her. His body rapidly flew backwards and chased after Bai Shanshui's afterimage. Cries of surprise rang out like a tidal wave. No one had expected that General Yang and the mysterious bureau chief, who had just displayed strength far beyond what they had shown in the past, would be defeated at the same time in an instant. Liang Lian took a deep breath. His body seemed to fill up. The long sword in his hand rose like a crowbar and hit Bai Shanshui's falling life-bond sword. There was an indescribable dull sound in the world. It was like there was a divine warrior driving a stake. Liang Lian was unable to move Bai Shanshui's sword. His long sword was still in an upward position, but his metal body was nailed into the ground by Bai Shanshui's sword. Waves of mud rose around Liang Lian's body. In this moment, Liang Lian's body was cut into the ground. Only his head and his right hand that was holding the sword remained above the ground. His body had been much larger than Bai Shanshui, but at this time, Bai Shanshui stood in front of him and was many times taller. Bai Shanshui coughed up some bloody foam. A cold smile once again appeared on her face. Her sword retracted a bit along with the shock wave, and then she swung it down again steadily. More shocked gasps sounded in the distance. Everyone could see that Liang Lian could not withstand her attack. No one in the surroundings could stop Bai Shanshui's attack. Also, there was a flying sword that was close to Bai Shanshui. Li Yunrui's figure was only 100 feet away from Bai Shanshui. His flying sword was at his side. Finally here. But at this time, Bai Shanshui raised her head. She seemed to be speaking to Li Yunrui, but also seemed to be talking to herself. Li Yunrui looked up. There were some pale, flowing flames in the sky. These pale streams of fire seemed to be exactly the same as the ones that had appeared above the alley. But for some reason, these pale streams of fire that were not dazzling made it difficult for him to open his eyes. Chapter 325. In the serene imperial palace, the Empress' feet left the ground. Her perfect body emitted countless cold and pure rays of light, which passed through the holy light in the courtyard and into the endless starry sky. Her face was absolutely indifferent, a kind of indifference that did not carry any joy of the world. On the outskirts of Chongling, the pale streams of fire falling from the sky were extremely cold and cruel. Many cultivators in Chongling, especially those who had experienced the bloody coup a dozen years ago, felt this absolute cold presence that had not appeared for a long time and couldn't help but tremble. Bai Shanshui looked up at the streams of fire. All the reeds around her that had not been destroyed in the previous battle snapped and fell to the ground. It was as if there were countless small invisible hammers smashing down on the ground, causing layers of dust to explode. Time seemed to stop flowing at this moment. The green sword in her hand was just a few feet away from Liang Lian. The pale streams of fire looked very far away, but in everyone's perception, these streams of fire were quickly approaching Bai Shanshui and Liang Lian's bodies. Li Yunrui felt awe. This was awe towards power and sword essence. These pale streams of fire contained the most cold sword essence, like it could sever all emotions in the world. It was so pure and perfect that it had a kind of divine light. Any sword essence, when extreme, meant power. This sword was out of the world, almost like the will of the heavens. Everyone knew that the mistress of Chongling was strong and had never been defeated. But when he saw this sword essence tonight, he understood that the other was stronger than he had imagined. What else could he do? If this was what Bai Shanshui was waiting for, then what was Bai Shanshui waiting for? Li Yunrui closed his eyes and did not look at the extremely cold sword essence. His flying sword carried a peaceful presence of waiting for the final judgment as it continued to circle around him and Bai Shanshui. At this moment, he subconsciously thought that if he really died here with this great rebel, it wouldn't be too bad. Bai Shanshui's body started to tremble violently under the pressure of the cold sword essence. Pain appeared on her pale face, but her eyes flashed with even more arrogance and fanaticism. Her sword no longer fell towards Liang Lian's head, but instead swung upwards. A green heavenly river formed above her body and welcomed the pale flames that were filled with divine radiance. Even though this thick green celestial river gave off an indescribable arrogance, it was just a mortal presence. It could not compare to the perfect sword essence falling from the sky. In the perception of all the Chongling cultivators in the distance, Bai Shanshui, who was seriously injured, could not stop such a perfect attack. Yet in this moment, Chief Inspector Chun, who had not changed expression even when his collarbone was cut and his aorta almost severed, suddenly changed expression. He gave a howl like never before. The flying sword hanging in front of him suddenly lit up like a star and rushed towards Bai Shanshui. No one could understand Chief Inspector Chin's panic, and no one had the time to do anything. The pale flowing fire had already fallen to the ground. Countless people were horrified. Just as these pale white streams of fire fell to the ground, it was as if a bright world had been born beneath the ground. Countless cracks appeared on the ground, and pale white and cold divine radiance also surged out of the cracks. This scene only stayed in everyone's eyes for a moment. Then the ground exploded. As an enormous ball of light rose from the ground, countless pieces of shattered land flew up. Everyone saw Yang Lian's body fly out along with the pieces of shattered land. His body emitted a dazzling black iron flame, but compared to the pale white light below him, it was exceptionally dim. It was so faint that it was like an inconspicuous shadow. Chief Inspector Chin's flying sword reached the edge of the ball of light, but was stopped by the expanding presence. It clearly slowed down. Compared to the previous rapid battle, everything seemed to be in slow motion. Just the remaining power was enough to make the flying sword of a Realm 7 cultivator difficult to pass. But at this time, Bai Shanshui was still standing, causing many people to stop breathing. Bai Shanshui's body was also flying up, but she stood firmly on a piece of land that was flying up. Her figure was very steady. She was dressed in white robes. Under the light of the pale white ball of light under her feet, she did not dim, but appeared even more dazzling. Then everyone saw the light of water. Countless glowing streams of water appeared under the pale white ball of light. Li Yunrui's body was nailed to the ground under his feet like a nail. That half of the thin sword piece still stubbornly danced around him and Bai Shanshui. In this moment, he and Bai Shanshui exchanged a look. He understood what Bai Shanshui was waiting for. At this time, the tremors in Chongling had completely stopped. All the tremors seemed to have found an outlet, and the outlet was under their feet. The Wei Cloud Water Palace was the best in the world in controlling water. Bai Shanshui had told him that the tremors came from the Yin River under Chongling. The Yin River was a waterway, but these rivers were deep underground. Only when they were completely flowing could Bai Shanshui sense the flow of the Yin River and find a suitable exit before her vital energy ran out. Even more importantly, she had to have great power to help her open a passage. To capture a cultivator of her level alive, there had to be a power stronger than her. So she had been waiting for Zheng Xiu's true power. So she had disregarded the damage to her body and used such a method to fight Liang Lian. The perfect pit, the rain that flew up against the sky, the gushing spring that attacked Liang Lian, and the life-bond sword attack were all setting up this final situation. Zhang Xiu did not want to kill her directly. Therefore, even though her last sword strike was filled with a fervent and untamed aura, it was actually a very gentle sword strike. Water was originally soft. Her attack was not meant to be a defense, but to use the softest sword move to protect herself. In this moment, Chief Inspector Chen sensed her sword essence, but it was still too late. Shouts sounded from the distant reeds, but the path to survival had appeared. Who could stop Bai Shanshui's serpent from returning to the sea? Glowing water surged out of the ground. The cold and pale ball of light dyed the world and became weak and powerless. Then it collapsed into shadows and started to disappear. Beneath Bai Shanshui, there was the sound of an army galloping. Waves of energy charged out, and in the end, it was like a breath was exhaled and exhausted. The thousands of streams of water gathered into one place, turning into an unimaginably thick pillar of water that charged into the sky. Li Yunrui's gaze passed by Shanshui's figure to the distant line of fire. Looking at the Qin dynasty army that paled under the torches, he felt heartfelt respect for this white-robed woman. But at this time, his usual calmness disappeared. His expression changed dramatically. He shouted at Bai Shanshui, "Careful!" A dark green shadow appeared in the enormous pillar of water under Bai Shanshui's feet. The moment Li Yunrui spoke, there was a strange sound. This shadow grew furiously like an enormous water plant. A terrifying wave of energy appeared in the enormous pillar of water and was about to split the entire pillar of water apart. Bai Shanshui's heart sank to the extreme, and her body turned cold. She was familiar with the presences coming from under her feet. That sword belonged to Lien Bo, one of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty, and the person holding the sword was the master of the great floating water prison, Shan Xian. These two were skilled in water, and were the opponents she feared the most in Chongling. From the start of this ambush, she had been most worried about the appearance of these two people. Yet she had never expected them to appear in such a way at this time. Had that perfect woman in the imperial palace guessed her intentions when Chongling started to tremble and arranged for such a move? Or had Xin Xian, who was familiar with Chongling's water, assassinated her in such a way? Bai Shanshui could not guess. She only felt endless anger. Icy anger surged out of her heart and spread to every part of her body. Her power was used up. Don't! However, at this moment, her body shook violently again and she let out a fierce roar. A thin sword light with a fearless aura passed through the waves and clashed with the dark green sword light that was growing wildly like seaweed. There was a muffled bang. The wind and waves rose. The thin sword was sent flying by the scattering waves. This flying sword could not stop Xinxian's attack that had been prepared for a long time. Li Yunrui also knew that his attack could not stop Xinxian. Go! He glanced at the howling Bai Shanshui. The moment he spoke, he threw his body out like a sword. His body moved like a sword and stood in front of the green sword light. Bai Shanshui was silent. The inky green sword light passed through Li Yunrui's body. The glowing water behind him turned bright red, but his panicked expression became unusually calm. Go! He opened his mouth. Bai Shanshui could not hear his voice, but she could clearly see the shape of his mouth. Boom! Thousands of waves instantly engulfed the figures of these people. Chapter 326. The night was as calm as water, and a faint dawn appeared on the horizon. All of Chongling was quiet. Emo Shouqing, sitting on the rattan chair in a thin blanket, seemed to have fallen asleep. But when he heard footsteps behind him, he slowly opened his eyes. The stern general who had been ordered to leave appeared behind him with an ugly expression. He bowed and said in a cold voice, Bai Shanshui escaped, and that nameless cultivator was captured by Shan Xian. Emo Shouqing stilled slightly, shock in his dim yellow eyes. He said to himself, he still left. The stern general took a deep breath, controlled his emotions, and nodded. He said gravely, Bureau Chief Huang sent news that the Min Mountain Sword trials have ended. The winner is Xue Wangshu's disciple, Ding Ning. Emo Shoching stilled again. The stern general bowed and left without another word. Emo Shoching bowed his head in silence for a moment. The breeze at dawn blew at his ginseng-like hair, and then an emotional expression appeared at the corners of his mouth. The identity of that powerful and nameless young cultivator was worth investigating, but he knew that the Empress had mobilized tonight for the lonely mountain sword horde and to keep by Shanshui. Now, it was this nameless cultivator who had stayed. While he had not seen the scene with his own eyes, he could imagine how such a situation had occurred. Coincidentally, that wine shop youth had won first place in the Min Mountain Sword Trials. The Empress, who had never been defeated before, had lost twice in a row tonight. Thinking back to the perfect coldness of that sword essence, thinking about how Bai Shanshui and the wine shop youth had won, the old city guard couldn't help but sigh again. He sighed at the Empress' defeat tonight, her coldness losing to burning emotions. On Min Mountain, the sky was slightly bright. But as the sky gradually brightened, the tallest peak that looked like an indigo sword that was going to pierce a hole in the sky gradually faded and disappeared from the sight of everyone outside the mountain. In front of the cliff at the highest point of the mountain, Bailey Sushue stood silently like an even colder cliff. Looking at Bailey Sushue, who was looking coldly in the direction of Chongling, Jing Liuli's brows furrowed even tighter. He finally could not help but say, "What happened?" Chongling shakes, Starfire falls. Bailey Sushue raised his head and said with slight scorn, "Only the lonely mountain sword horde can make Zheng Xiu act like this?" Jing Liuli's expression turned cold. After a moment of silence, she narrowed her eyes and said, "The Emperor has reached Realm 8. If Zheng Xiu also obtains the lonely mountain sword horde, we will have the worry of the Bazenkindo ground." Bailey Sushue shook his head and sneered, "The present is different from the past. How can it be so easy?" In the past, Zhang Xiu and Yuanwu had to work together to defeat their greatest enemy, and now, their greatest enemy was himself. People like them love themselves the most in this world. How can their feelings for others be more intense than their feelings for themselves? At most, it's just a matter of weighing the benefits. Don't make me believe that the two of them are one and have an intimate relationship. The Qin dynasty has 2 ministers, 13 marquises, and the 2 bureau chiefs. There seem to be countless experts, but even at the Deer Mountain Conference and tonight, how many can fight? Donghu, Yuezhi, Western Chong. While they are called vassal countries and appear to be harmonious, why do they waste 3 armies and 3 marquises to station there? Outside of Liaodong and behind Yin Mountain, when has it ever been peaceful? After a pause, Bailey Sushue glanced at Jing Liuli, who was deep in thought, and said, "Does Yuanwu dare to put less Realm 7s in the Chu and Qi regions?" Jing Liuli frowned in thought and nodded slightly. In the past, Yuanwu and Zhang Xiu feared that their lives would be in the hands of others, and spared no expense. Is the glory of the Deer Mountain Conference not Yuanwu's glory alone? If not for Yuanwu, or Realm 8, could the Qin dynasty have gained anything at the Deer Mountain Conference? Bailey Sushue said with thick disdain, "This great show looks lively and beautiful, but thinking about it, how can it compare to when Ba Mountain Swordfield was the strongest? How can it have the glory of that time? In the past, even if there were more people like Bai Shanshui, would they dare to enter Chongling?" Jing Liuli's frown slowly relaxed. At this time, Bailey Sushue added coldly, "She may not be able to comprehend the lonely mountain sword horde. Even if she does, so what?" Jing Liuli looked up in shock. Bailey Sushue's previous words were not hard to understand, but she felt that these words were hard to understand. Min Mountain Sword Sect does not only have you, but also Ding Ning. Bailey Sushue glanced at her and said with apparent displeasure. Jing Liuli stilled and immediately understood her master's meaning. She did not feel any terror or unease, nodding and saying, "Yes." The conversation between the current sect master of Min Mountain Sword Sect and the next sect master finished. Jing Liuli turned, but as she moved, her figure suddenly stopped. She turned to look at Bailey Sushue and said seriously, "Master, do you really think that person leaving behind an heir is nonsense?" This was clearly a question the two had discussed. Bailey Sushue's eyebrows rose, a layer of frost appearing on his face. He said, "I saw that person die with my own eyes. What problem can there be?" The nine-death silkworm is so profound. Even with personal teaching, one may not be able to comprehend and cultivate it. How can someone learn without a teacher and cultivate the nine-death silkworm to a certain level? Jing Liuli sensed Bailey Sushua's deep displeasure and immediately bowed slightly in apology. Bailey Sushua's expression recovered its calm. He said softly in disdain, "There are no ghosts in the world, only ghosts in people's hearts. Zhang Xiao and Yuanwu have done so many things. It is normal to be afraid of certain things happening." Jing Liuli did not speak more. The hint of doubt in her heart was wiped away by her master's words. Her footsteps grew lighter as she left. The sun suddenly appeared. The golden light started to smear the mountains and dyed the edges of her body gold. Bailey Sushue did not turn around. He looked up at the golden light at the Chongling city that appeared in the world and laughed disdainfully. "You say you have never lost, but that is because the strongest people were on your side in the past, and the opponents you encountered later were not qualified and strong enough. Even the person who will not lose lost, who will not lose." The Kamway River flashed with light under the morning sun. A white figure slowly floated up from the bottom of the water. With the gentle slap of the waves, it was washed to the roots of the old willows on the shore. As it floated up, it was gradually bound by the water grasses and the roots of the old willows, as though these water grasses and roots were going to absorb nutrients and merge into one. The heat of the sun caused this white figure to move slightly. Bai Shanshui woke up. She saw her situation. Out of the corner of her eye, she could even see the merchant ships and the armored ships of the Qin dynasty passing by. Her cultivation was high, but she still felt weak at this moment. Her vital energy and blood were terrifyingly empty. Her skin was as pale as a floating corpse. Yet she did not move at all. She just lay in the water and looked at the sky through the cracks in the tree roots. The sky was still the same sky. However, many things had changed. Li Yunrui should have come to kill her, but in the end, she saved her. Even more importantly, she knew Li Yunrui would not die. It would be good if she died. But Chongling had the great floating water prison, the most terrifying thing for cultivators. Li Yunrui had landed in the hands of the master of the great floating water prison, Shan Xian. She was also the victor against Zhang Xiao on that night that had just passed away. She had successfully taken the lonely mountain sword horde and escaped Chongling, and was certain she could survive. But unlike Bailey Sushue right now, she did not have a happy mood. Chapter 327. What was truly heartless was time. Sunlight shone over Chongling, gilding each dilapidated courtyard with a layer of gold. Most of the people of Chongling started to hear that the shock last night came from the great rebel who had once sung wildly in Chongling. They slowly calmed down from their panic in the middle of the night. At this time, the news of the Min Mountain sword trials started to spread through Chongling. Countless gasps of disbelief and praise sounded in different corners of Chongling at different times. On this day, the name Ding Ning was heard in Chongling much more often than by Shan Shui. This ordinary youth who had been in Falling Parasol last year had miraculously become the winner of the Min Mountain sword trials. This was too legendary. His birth excited the people of Chongling even more. The formerly quiet Falling Parasol was filled with people. Countless carriages and horses even blocked the main road outside. Many people had come to see how this shabby alley was different from the other alleys, and how it had raised such a monster. Before this, in Chongling, in the entire Qin dynasty, there were only two true monsters, Jing Liuli and Embark. But now, all of Chongling, and soon all of the Qin dynasty, and the world knew that there was another Ding Ning. The streets and alleys were noisy and restless, but the wine shop with its doors tightly locked was still cold and quiet. The ground was covered in thick dust from last night's shock. Amidst the sounds of people approaching the door and the heated breaths, the dust in the hall floated and dimmed everything inside. In the bedroom in the inner courtyard, Zhang Sun Qianxue sat silently on the edge of the bed, her long eyelashes fluttering. Even though the news of Ding Ning's victory had come, she did not know if Bai Shanshui was alive or dead. She did not know if Bai Shanshui's movements last night would cause fatal danger to her. If Ding Ning did not return here, she could not be at ease. In the cold and lonely imperial palace, the empress, who had not slept last night, still looked so perfect. She showed no tiredness and no emotions different from usual. She wrote a letter herself and then casually handed it to a palace attendant standing next to her. She said calmly, "Have someone bring it to Zhang Yi. I heard that two powerful flying swords appeared in the outskirts of Chongling last night. One sword could stop dozens of mortal-grade flying swords. How do they compare to you? He broke through to the fourth realm and defeated a cultivator of the fifth realm. Do you think I can defeat him in the future?" A handsome young man in ordinary hemp clothes was speaking. He was standing on the edge of a precipice. In front of him, there was only a thin layer of clouds and mist. There was only a small, pale yellow sword without a handle floating in front of him. It trembled slightly with his breathing. The aura on the sword had a wonderful rhythm, as if it had a unique life of its own. There was no one else around, so he was talking to his flying sword. Judging from the way he spoke, it was not a whim, but a habit of talking to his flying sword. Even if a flying sword seemed to be alive, it was still a dead object that could not open its mouth. Talking to one's own flying sword would often make one feel very lonely. However, true geniuses were often lonely. The sunlight fell all over Chongling, but there were still many corners of Chongling that could not see the sun. Under the canopy that covered the sky, in the ghostly fish market, there was the sound of a zither. Multiple stalks of black bamboo swayed by the shady doorsill. In reality, the Empress' coldness is not just about using someone else to kill. The red-clothed lady, who had a gentle face and an extremely gentle tone, lowered her head slightly. She softly said to the stooped black-clothed old man, "The thing that she is the coldest and best at doing is to separate the people you care about from your side one by one." After this night, some people in Chongling were happy, some were sad, and some had just woken up. Xie Changsheng struggled to open his eyes. He felt the world outside was blinding, and then he felt the heat. Then he understood that this was the sunlight blinding him. He was certain he was alive. Then he could not help but laugh. He did not have much strength, but he used all his strength to laugh. As expected, Min Mountain Sword Sect did not watch him die. He was still alive. This was his victory. You dare to laugh so loudly with such serious wounds. You do not fear your wounds rupturing. A disdainful voice reached his ears. Xie Changsheng had not even seen the surroundings, and naturally did not see the speaker. But he said unconcernedly, "I will not die if my wounds rupture." The person who spoke was stunned, as if he couldn't refute his words. Xie Changsheng blinked his eyes proudly and slowly saw that he was in a green house. The ground and walls were blue, but not pure blue jade. So he could not help but smile in disdain. He said, "Blue jade is the path, blue jade is the hall. I thought that Min Mountain Sword Sect was extremely rich. So it is just the decorations on the outside, and the inside is just blue stone of similar color. Rich is rich. You look at everything with the aura of a copper coin." Hearing the even more disdainful voice, Xie Changsheng managed to turn his head and stilled. He saw a young woman in blue robes standing in the doorway looking coldly at him. Then he immediately recalled that this young woman in blue robes was Jing Lioli, who had made him feel inferior. Strange, he couldn't help but mutter after a moment of daze. Jing Lioli glanced at him and said, "What is strange?" Xie Changsheng hesitated and said honestly, "I seem to have been very afraid of you before, but now I do not seem to be afraid." Jing Lioli frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Xie Changsheng laughed. "It should be that I have already died once. What is there to be afraid of? Also, in my opinion, I made a bet with Min Mountain Sword Sect that they would not let me die. Now that I have one against all of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Of course, I will not fear you, a genius of Min Mountain Sword Sect." Jing Lioli showed a disdainful smile and turned around. A foolish, self-comforting thought. Xie Changsheng was not angry. Looking at her back, he suddenly thought of an important matter and shouted, "The Min Mountain Sword trials have ended?" Jing Lioli's steps paused slightly. "It has ended." Xie Changsheng's body stiffened slightly. "Who is first?" Jing Lioli said without looking back, Ding Ning. Xie Changsheng was stunned. Ha 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 ha. In the next moment, he once again used all the strength he could muster to laugh out loud. Jing Liuli did not look back. Her brow furrowed deeply again. Facing such a foolish and reckless Guanzhong disciple, she did not even have a reason to be angry. Almost at the same time, there were people waking up in Chongling. Liang Lian was waking up. In fact, he wasn't really unconscious. It was just that the limitless sword body that he cultivated had a unique sword-nurturing technique. When others seemed to be unconscious, he could use this technique to suppress and heal the injuries in his body. At this moment, there was not enough time to heal his injuries. He should be unconscious for a longer period of time. Yet he knew he had to wake up early. Even if he had many hidden wounds that were hard to heal, he had to wake up early. Amidst the flapping of the war banners, he woke up in the tent of the Middle Army and opened his eyes. But unlike usual, there was not even a soldier holding a sword in the Middle Army tent, or even at the door. Almost at the same time, in a room not far from Xie Changsheng, Ding Ning also woke up. Chapter 328. You woke up at least 8 hours earlier than I expected. When Ding Ning woke up, an ordinary voice reached his ears. The person who spoke had an ordinary appearance, so ordinary that he would not attract attention on the streets. It was just that he had an illustrious, or even frightening, past. He was one of the strongest people in Min Mountain Sword Sect, human chef Gungren. Ding Ning slowly turned his head and looked at Gungren standing by his bed. He did not have much of an expression and said seriously, "Many thanks." Gungren nodded in return and said, "You are welcome. You can call me Sect Uncle in the future." Ding Ning nodded and said, "Sect Uncle." Gungren smiled slightly and pointed to the left side of Ding Ning's bed. Normally, reading with serious wounds hurts the mind the most. But you are not an ordinary person, so you can read this first. There was a thin book on the left side of Ding Ning's bed. It was an ordinary silk page. While it was clearly a handwritten copy and not a rare ancient book, if any other cultivator in Chongling saw the name on this thin book, they would be shocked. 7 Books of Cultivation. Ding Ning saw the name on the cover of this book, but he did not show the joy that Gungren had imagined. He thought for a moment, and then looked at Gungren. "I want to return to Chongling first." Gungren looked in surprise at Ding Ning. He thought that Ding Ning might know what kind of sutra this was. So he explained gently, "These 7 books of cultivation are the introductory body cultivation method of Min Mountain Sword Sect. It is equivalent to the Min Mountain Sword Sect's vital energy cultivation method. The most profound cultivation methods of Min Mountain Sword Sect are based on the meridians of this sutra." Ding Ning shook his head and said, "I know what sutra this is. I also know that the 7 books of cultivation are one of the secret sutras of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Even in Min Mountain Sword Sect, only a portion of the disciples have the opportunity to study and come into contact with the secret sutras that truly represent the essence of Min Mountain Sword Sect." Gungren was even more surprised. He did not ask why Ding Ning wanted to return to Chongling first. He looked seriously into Ding Ning's eyes and said, "You should know that you do not have much time. All of Chongling is shocked because you won, but your victory has caused them to temporarily overlook a fact." After a pause, Gungren said gently, "For other people, winning first in the Min Mountain Sword Trials means a bright future. But they overlook that your energies are too strong. You have to hurry." Ding Ning looked calmly at him and said, "I know." Gungren nodded and said patiently, "I know that with your comprehension, you may be able to quickly comprehend a sutra like this. But there are some things you may not know. Some of the cultivation methods of Min Mountain Sword Sect are not like ordinary methods, or rather, they are too different." Ding Ning looked at him and did not respond. Gungren also looked at him and then slowly said, "Min Mountain Sword Sect has some methods that other sects cannot match, and we have accumulated some things that ordinary cultivation places do not have. But there are some things that a person's strength is limited, and not everything is omnipotent. With your current physical condition, there is only one way to solve this problem." Ding Ning naturally knew which method he was speaking of. This method was even more important to him than the legendary Lonely Mountain Sword Horde. So even though he had guessed that Gung Ren was going to speak of this method, when he heard Gung Ren speak of it, his breathing grew disorderly and his body started to tremble uncontrollably. Gung Ren looked at Ding Ning's eyes and said in a more serious tone, "This method is unique in that it creates another energy sea. The effect of that energy sea is like the organs in the body and can even replace some of the effects of our organs. But it is not just difficult to comprehend. The cultivation method must also connect many meridian points. Connecting each meridian point requires time." Min Mountain Sword sect originally had very few people who comprehended and chose to cultivate this method. Gung Ren grimaced and then said, "Even more importantly, not every Min Mountain Sword sect cultivator with enough talent can choose to cultivate this method. There are 9 levels of the Sword Pagoda. One must make enough contributions to Min Mountain Sword sect for each level." Ding Ning took a deep breath and said, "Since this method is so important, it should be in the highest level of the Min Mountain Sword sect Sword Pagoda. So, one must make great contributions to Min Mountain Sword sect in order to see it?" Gung Ren nodded. Ding Ning muttered, "Can't we make an exception?" "This is the rule of Min Mountain Sword sect," Gung Ren said with a grimace. "In Min Mountain Sword sect, what cannot be broken is called a rule. Everyone obeys the rules. Min Mountain Sword sect is much stronger than Chongling," Ding Ning said after a moment of silence. Gung Ren thought that Ding Ning had such emotions because of White Goat Cave's experiences. He did not comment and said, "Since you know this, you should hurry." Ding Ning glanced at the records by his ear and then at Gung Ren. He said, "If possible, sect uncle, please prepare a carriage for me. I will start reading from the carriage." Gung Ren stilled and then nodded. He said, "Your status is different from the past. Since you have decided to return to Chongling, you need to prepare more than just a carriage." Liang Lian slowly sat up on the bed. His breathing had already stabilized not long after he woke up. However, as his expression became cold again, his breathing deliberately became disorderly. Then he coughed violently and spat out blood. Footsteps sounded. A vice-general in black armor pushed open the curtain and entered. Liang Lian looked at this vice-general who should have been waiting outside the tent. His gaze did not change much. He waved his hand and said, "Have the strategist come over." This vice-general bowed his head slightly, his eyes flashing as he acknowledged and retreated. Moments later, the tent opened again. The sound of the war banners flapping in the wind grew louder inside the tent. Chi Pumo, dressed in black robes, appeared in front of Liang Lian. Liang Lian stopped coughing and looked indifferently at Chi Pumo. He said, "How are the other two?" Chi Pumo bowed respectfully and said, "The nameless cultivator has entered the great floating water prison. Bai Shanshui escaped." Liang Lian's breathing paused and he coughed violently again. With a puff, he spat out another mouthful of blood. Chi Punmo looked up and was about to speak when he suddenly felt a coldness from the deepest depths of the earth attack his heart. His expression changed dramatically, his feet paused and his body flew back. At the same time, a mottled small sword that looked like a snow-dyed wintersweet branch came out of his right sleeve along with a powerful wave of primal energies of the universe. The entire tent swelled up under this sudden burst of powerful energy, emitting a heart-palpitating explosion. Liang Lian's expression was still indifferent as he sat motionless. There was a clang in front of him. His lifebond sword flashed like a black dragon coming out of the sea. It immediately charged at the thin flying sword that flew out of Chi Punmo's sleeve. It shook the small sword away and stabbed into Chi Punmo's body. With a crash, dozens of cracks appeared in the tent. Waves of energy visible to the naked eye charged out. With a scream, Chi Punmo's body fell through the air with the 2 curtains and landed in front of the tent door. Pew! Liang Lian spat out another mouthful of blood. This mouthful of fresh blood was a sign that he had suffered an even more serious injury. Chi Punmo's lungs had been torn apart by this sword. His shattered bones and organs were exposed to the air, but he still did not die. His lightless eyes were filled with great disbelief and reluctance. Pieces of flesh flowed out of his mouth, but he still spoke. "Why? You and I understand each other too well." Liang Lian looked coldly at the bright red blood in front of him and looked down. You and I are the only survivors of many battles. What we are best at is surviving. You are familiar with the places I am familiar with. If I kill you, I will be the only one familiar with our place outside the pass. She wants you to replace me. If I kill you now, I will lead the army there, and I will be the only one left. If I die, you live. Or if you die, I live. You are a very smart person, but you are not vicious enough. You are too slow. Even more importantly, your cultivation is not as good as mine. So after so many years, even though you and I have survived, I am a general, and you are just a strategist. Hearing these cold voices, Chi Pumo painfully exhaled his last breath. Liang Lian did not look at his corpse, or at the shocked soldiers who had rushed over after hearing the commotion. He thought coldly of that perfect and cold woman and said to himself, "Those who climbed out of a pile of corpses, those who stepped on the bloody path in Chongling, will have a harder life. If you want me to die, I will not die so easily." The military flag outside the tent flapped in the wind, muffling his voice at this moment. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.